Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight we got our boy back, Demetrian Titus versus some Necrons. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for Emperor. I want to thank you guys for your support. Y'all been absolutely killing it. Now, let's get into the madness.
Nova Magnar had been dying for a long time before any man on its surface understood that the dead had begun to answer. It was a forge burdened by duty and kept alive by exhaustion. Its continents were not remembered by their ancient names any longer, save in the dust-choked libraria of old cathedral keeps and the data crypts of administratum adepts who had long since forgotten what beauty looked like. Men called them by their outputs now: Steel Continent, Munitions Continent, Grain Plateau, Refinery C, Hive Belt Alpha, Hive Belt Secundus. The world had been measured, audited, flensed into utility, and offered up to Ultramar's wars by the sacred arithmetic of the tithe. Every river had a quota, every mine a labor target, every habstack a census ledger, every womb a future worker, every worker a future corpse. Across the nightside, manufactoria the size of kingdoms breathed poison into the heavens in slow black exhalations. Chimneys rose like dead forests of iron. Conveyor. Causeways crossed entire horizons. Pilgrim trains ran beneath shrine districts built atop older shrine districts, all of it layered over bones and bedrock and forgotten foundations. Billions of souls toiled under the eye of the Aquila and the cold patience of the Munitorum, feeding shell factories, assembly shrines, promethium processors, hab spires, troop depots, macro rail yards and shipyards that never slept. The world existed to give and to keep giving until there was nothing left to strip from its flesh. It had known unrest before: food riots, labor secessions, cult purges, tithe deficits, machine failures, plague quarantines, transit collapses. On Nova Magnar, suffering was not an aberration, it was governance. Men endured it because endurance was holy, and because the Imperium did not ask whether its subjects could bear the weight placed upon them. It asked only whether they had broken yet. Then the blackouts began. At first they were filed as routine infrastructure failure, a relay collapse beneath Hive Vortigern, a lumen grid dying in the underworks of Bellatrix Magna, Vox interference in the subrail tunnels beneath the western manufactoria arc of Gathis Reach, missing sump crews, silence from maintenance stations, patrols delayed, patrols overdue, patrols gone. The reports came upward through the usual chains of neglect. A clerk stamped them. A superior glanced at them and passed them on. A scribe recategorized them under labor disruption. A functionary of the Adeptus Arbites requested clarification. A local commander asked for more men he had not been allotted. The system of the Imperium did what it always did. It continued. Then they found the first bodies. Lieutenant Marius Holt of the Nova Magnoran Auxilia had served 13 standard years in trench lines, riot suppression corridors, and ash waste convoy escorts. He had seen men pulped by shell bursts, liquefied by plasma malfunctions, and opened stem to stern by mining saws turned in mutiny. He had learned that disgust was a luxury for those who did not spend their lives knee-deep in mortal ruin. But what he saw under Bellatrix Magna stripped the discipline from him for one shivering heartbeat and left something feral clawing at the base of his spine. The patrol lumen swept across a service tunnel and found 4 of his missing men nailed to the wall by nothing visible. Not nailed. That was what his mind named it first, because the truth was worse. Their bodies had been stripped to glistening red architecture. Skin gone, fat gone, most of the muscle gone. Their skeletons showed through curtains of wet ruin, and the ribs shone like butcher's hooks in the lumen beam. One of them still wore the lower half of his flak coat. Another had both hands locked around his laser gun with the discipline of death, though the barrel had been eaten away to powder. Their faces were not faces. Teeth, jawbones, the ragged shine of exposed skull. Holt heard one of his men retch inside his Rebreather. "Hold your line," he snapped, though his own throat had tightened. He stepped closer, because command was often only the act of walking toward that which every sane instinct begged a man to flee. The wall behind the dead auxiliaries was smooth ferrocrete, or had been. A swathe of it had been sheared into grey dust, as though a beam of hungry light had licked across it and devoured matter itself. The floor was carpeted with the residue, fine powder, pale as old ash. Sergeant Bren knelt beside the nearest corpse, muttering a half-remembered prayer to the throne. "No blade marks, sir." "Then what?" Bren looked up. His eyes were wide behind the visor lenses. "I do not know." The vox in Holt's ear gave a burst of static violent enough to make him flinch. A voice crackled through, broken into fragments and screams of machine distortion. "Sub-level 9 responding. Contact in the dark. Emperor preserve us. It cut through Jalen. It cut through..." The transmission became a wash of shrieking interference. Holt raised his fist. The patrol froze. There was a sound ahead in the dark. Not footsteps. Metal, he thought. Not the clank of labor servitors or the dragging gait of a damaged loader unit. This was smoother. A dry, articulate sound, like chains being drawn slowly over polished stone. The lumen beam reached down the corridor and showed only dust motes and the long throat of the tunnel. Then Bren's head vanished. One instant the sergeant was crouched at Holt's side. The next he was a stump of neck spraying red across the wall. His helmet spun away, empty, clattering across the powder in a widening arc. The thing that had killed him was already among them, a blur of metal bones and green eyes. Holt fired by reflex. Lass bolts slashed the dark. One struck a ribcage of living silver and burst in a flare of heat that would have blown a man apart. The thing only twisted, impossibly fast, and carved Trooper Selk from shoulder to hip in a single sweep of elongated blades. Someone shouted, "Xenos!" Holt saw only impressions. A skeletal form, limbs too many or moving too quickly to count. A skull face of pitiless alloy, green light spilling from within like witchfire from a crypt. Then the patrol line broke into a red geometry of chopped men and screaming ricochets. "Fall back!" Holt roared. "Back to the junction! Move! Move, you bastards!" He emptied his pistol into the shape and watched one of its shoulders burst into fragments. The pieces writhed, drew back, reformed. The thing came at him. A detonation from the rear of the tunnel lit everything white. Demolition charge. Private Cassian, Emperor bless the fool, had slapped a mining cutter bomb against the tunnel support and triggered it without orders. The corridor convulsed. Holt threw himself flat as ferrocrete and dust and broken conduit screamed downward. The metallic horror vanished behind the collapse. For a few breaths, there was only darkness, choking powder, and the wet coughing of dying men. Holt rose to one knee. 5 of his patrol remained, one of them without an arm, another clutching his belly, where his flak plates had been cut open like paper. Bren's headless body lay amid the dust. The wall corpses looked on with eyeless patience. "What in the throne's name was that?" whispered one of the survivors. Holt had no answer. He found himself staring at the powder-scoured wall, at the residue where solid matter had simply ceased to be. Every old campaign tale came back to him then. Tomb worlds, metal revenants, ancient enemies older than mankind's first fire. He had dismissed such stories as frontline liturgy, the kind of half-sacred nonsense soldiers cherished when the guns went quiet. He did not dismiss them any longer. "Get the Vox live," he said. "All channels. Priority Vermilion. Tell command the underworks are compromised. Tell them the dead have risen." In high orbit, where the void was black and pitiless and honest, Captain Demetrian Titus stood upon the strategium deck of the strike cruiser and looked down at Nova Magnar through a hololithic shell of data and dim red light. The vessel had come from war and bore war's scars openly. Its hull plating was patched and blackened. its internal decks crowded with overworked serfs, scarred armorers, and sleepless chapter thralls, hauling munitions and replacement seals, where no replacement was sufficient. It was not a ship prepared for parade or ceremony. It was a blade kept sharp by continued use, pitted from impact, still lethal. Around Titus, bridge crews and fleet officers worked at their stations with disciplined haste. Auspex returns flickered in layered sigils. Orbital defense zones glimmered over the world below. Shipping routes, convoy lanes, resource uplinks, shrine cities, hive concentrations, all of it rotated in amber and blood-red light around the image of Nova Magnar like the data ghost of a dissected organ. Titus wore his power armor as though it were a second oath laid over the first. The blue of the ultramarines was scored and weathered, the gold trim dulled by ash and impact abrasion. He stood broad and still, a figure of ceramite, scars and contained force. There was nothing theatrical in him. No need to posture, no need to remind lesser men of what he was. His presence did that without assistance. At his right stood Mataurus, helm mag locked at his hip, jaw clenched, his gaze on the tactical display with the hungry severity of a warrior already measuring where he would have to kill. Ancient Gadriel remained near the rear of the chamber, immense even for an Astartes, the company standard furled against its staff, his scarred face set in the grave stillness of one who had carried the memory of too many dead men. Dinal Cornelius, the librarian, watched the hololith with eyes in which cold concentration warred against a deeper unease. Commodore Gaius, Silver of the Fleet, stood among his officers in dark naval warplate, his face gaunt from void service and lit by the ghost lights of tactical rune screens. A local astropath, blindfolded and shaking, had just finished recounting the surface reports: missing patrols, grid failures, underhive disappearances, Gauss-like residue, according to the best terrified judgment of men who had never expected to speak the word aloud. Silver drew a breath through his nose. The governor insisted it was insurgency. He spoke of labor cells and undersump piracy. By the time he accepted the possibility of Xenos, a third of his sub-level network had already gone dark. Titus did not look at the Commodore. His eyes remained on the image of the world below. Governors are appointed for their reliability, not their imagination. Mataurus gave a hard smile that was not amusement. Then this one was true to type. Silver almost answered, thought better of it, and instead gestured to the hololith. We began deep scan sweeps on your approach. The first passes showed nothing. Then Magos teams adjusted the frequency spread. Captain, there are structures beneath the crust. At his signal, the display changed. The surface of Nova Magnar peeled away in layers of light, hive foundations, transit arteries, reservoir vaults, magma boreholes, underworks and utility chasms. Then deeper still, through bedrock strata and forgotten caverns, the hidden shape became visible. No human hand had wrought it. Great geometric voids lay entombed in the planet's mantle, arranged with mathematical cruelty. Angles too pure, cavities too vast, cylindrical shafts descending in perfect sequence into blackness. Complexes nested inside complexes, galleries and chambers, and sepulchral spaces laid out in patterns that mocked geology. The image looked like a blade driven into the heart of the world and twisted there until stone itself had learned obedience. Silence settled over the chamber. Gadriel broke it first, his voice a low growl. A tomb. Yes, said Titus. No man argued. Cornelius took one step toward the display. Psychic hood coils whispered. He reached out, not touching the hololith, as though sensing the shape beneath the light. For an instant his expression became very distant. Then he convulsed. The librarian cried out in a voice that was not wholly human, and staggered backward as blood ran from his nose and one eye. Blue-white witchlight flashed around his fingers. Deck officers recoiled. Mataurus seized him before he struck the deck, but Cornelius thrashed with sudden violence, gasping through clenched teeth. "Cold," he rasped. "By Guilliman's blood, it is cold. It knows. It knows we are here." Titus stepped down from the command dais at once. "Report!" Cornelius fought for control. His breath came ragged. "There is a presence beneath the crust, vast, mechanical, layered, not one mind, a congress of dead intellects. And, behind them," he stopped, shuddering as though his spine had turned to ice. "Speak," Titus said. Cornelius looked up. For the first time since Titus had known him, there was naked fear in the librarian's eyes. Something hungry. The deck alarms began to howl. Not the measured call of void contact. Not the warning for incoming ordnance or reactor instability. This was a chorus of overlapping emergency tones from the planet below. Surface feeds bursting alive all at once in red after red after red. Silver turned to his screens. Multiple urban distress channels. Emperor's Mercy. The hololith shifted to surface pict captures. Bellatrix Magna, Hive Vortigern, Gathis Reach, Sanctum Rail District. A dozen more, then 100. Streets buckling. Plaza stones splitting open. Hab block basements vomiting green light. Foundation piers cracking beneath cathedra and factorum complexes as ancient mechanisms thrust upward through ferrocrete and shrine marble alike. In Ardenop, one feed, a wide boulevard folded inward as if the earth had grown jaws. From the rupture rose a slab-sided gate of black metal traced in viridian fire. It opened without sound. Rank upon rank of skeletal warriors marched from within, weapons held in perfect unison, their eyes burning the color of corpse lanterns. In another, a transit station ceiling blew out from below, and a phalanx emerged through a train full of laborers, stripping flesh from bone with a storm of gas fire that left only drifting ash and shrieks cut short. Elsewhere, entire hab clusters simply sagged as something immense displaced the foundations beneath them. The buildings dropped. Millions of tons of habitation towers came down in a slow, obscene collapse, and from the dust there rose silver forms advancing without haste, without battle cries, without any need to feign life. Titus watched for 3 heartbeats. That was enough. "Signal all companies," he said. His voice did not rise. It became harder. "Immediate combat deployment. Surface insertion priority to Bellatrix Magna transit districts and central hive arteries. Silver, keep orbit clear and maintain scan lock on every rupture point you can track. Gadriel, with me. Mataurus, take assault elements east of the primary breach and prevent envelopment. Cornelius, you are not dead yet." The librarian wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "No, my captain. Then you deploy." No speeches followed. No invocation beyond what duty itself already demanded. The deck became motion and command. Orders flashed. Servitors shrieked Binharic acknowledgements. Launch preparations thundered through the cruiser's internal vox. The ultramarines moved with the terrible calm of men who had done this 1,000 times across 1,000 worlds. The first thing Titus smelled when his Thunderhawk's ramp dropped over Bellatrix Magna was burning metal and cooked meat. The transit district had been a knot of rail, spines, cargo exchanges, worker habs, shrine kiosks, and ticketing concourses stacked above one another in tiers. Now it was a broken furnace. Tracks hung in the air like snapped ribs. One magrail engine lay on its side, still moving, its machine spirit screaming through fractured vox horns as green fire ate through the carriages one by one. Civilians and auxiliary troopers alike ran through smoke dense enough to hide them until the gorse fire found them, and then they became outlines of light before turning to drifting debris. Titus hit the ground at the head of his warriors, and the district seemed to draw one harsh breath around him. "Form on me," he voxed. "Advance by spear, break the phalanx, deny them the junction." Bolter fire erupted with the familiar, murderous authority of the Adeptus Astartes. Mass reactive shells detonated through the leading Necron ranks, blowing silver skeletons apart in showers of shredded necrodermis and sparking bone metal. Gadriel crashed. into the line beside Titus, standard unfurled now, the sacred icon snapping in furnace wind as if daring the enemy to profane it. Mataurus and his squad broke off at the eastern causeway and vanished into smoke and strobe light. Auxiliary troopers who had been seconds from collapse looked up, saw the blue giant striding through the hell of the station, and remembered how to stand. "Hold the barricade," Titus barked at a cowering line officer whose faceplate was spattered with another man's blood. "Do not pursue. Do not break formation. Let them come into your fire." The officer swallowed and managed, "Yes, Lord." A wave of scarab constructs boiled from a split platform edge, swarming over the dead and dying in a glittering black tide. Titus strode into them, and his chainsword became a roaring crescent of oil, sparks, and pulverized machine fragments. He fired his sidearm point blank into a warrior's skull, and stamped another through the chest hard enough to crack the floor beneath it. But even as they fell, even as disciplined bolter volleys tore channels through them, Titus saw the wrongness of it. Necrons advanced with purpose always, with precision, with cruel inevitability. Yet there was a speed in these ones, a sharpness bordering on frenzy. They pivoted too quickly, closed too aggressively, broke from perfect formation to hurl themselves into closer slaughter. Several ignored exposed human survivors entirely in order to rush the Astartes line, as though some deeper command imperative burned brighter than the harvest of flesh. Cornelius's voice came over the squad net, strained. "Captain, they are not merely awakening. Something is driving them, forcing coherence, forcing—" Static swallowed the rest. Ahead, beyond the smoke-veiled platforms and the rain of sparks from a collapsing overhead rail, something massive registered on Titus's helm auspex. A signal spike, then distortion. The rune would not resolve. It towered above the battle line somewhere in the deeper ruin, tall as a contemptor engine, its energy signature flickering in and out like a wound in reality. Titus fired again, dropped another pair of advancing warriors, and looked into the smoke. For an instant, he saw it, a silhouette only. Elongated, regal, malformed by interference and distance. A high-bladed shape standing still, while battle raged around it. Green eyes, a frame that seemed too narrow and too immense at once. Around it, lesser constructs moved with sudden violence, like hounds scenting a master. Then every vox channel in the district burst into life, with the same broken whisper, repeated in the voices of the dead, the wounded, the machine-distorted, and the half-mad. Amintar. The name crawled through static and blood and fire. Amintar. Titus raised his bolter toward the shadow as the transit district shook beneath another eruption from below, and all across Nova Magnar the buried dead began to climb toward the living. Dawn should have come to Nova Magnar in iron, ash, and the weak, bruised gold of a sun, fighting to be seen through a poisoned atmosphere. Instead, it came green. The first light that touched the hive belts was the light of Gauss discharge, crawling over ferrocrete canyons and shrine towers in cold arterial flashes. It painted the underbellies of smoke clouds with corpse fire luminescence. It shone through drifting industrial soot in long murderous spears, carving silhouettes out of men and engines and hab facades before reducing them to cinders and powder. The true sun remained somewhere above the smog, blind and distant and irrelevant. Beneath it, Nova Magnar burned by a harsher star. Across Bellatrix Magna, Vortigern, Gathis Reach, and the linked transit cities of the central manufactorial arc, defense lasers stabbed blindly up through ash haze and chem fog toward threats they could not yet see. Their beams lanced the clouds in violent red bars, seeking void intruders, seeking trooplanders, seeking anything sensible. There was nothing sensible to strike. The enemy was below. The enemy was within. Beneath the foundation piers of cathedra, below sump canals and shell foundries, under the burial vaults of saints, and the machine crypts of dockyards long stripped bare, ancient gates were opening and dead things were climbing out in disciplined silence. Bellatrix Magna had become a wound too large to close. Entire districts were veiled in the dust of collapsed hab stacks. Fire rolled through the mag rail arteries where fuel lines had ruptured. Civilian columns stumbled through side streets with all the doomed order of ants fleeing a kicked nest, only to be cut apart when green beams licked through smoke and flesh alike. The city was huge beyond sane comprehension, a vertical empire of labor blocks and cathedral bridges and transit vaults stacked upon older centuries of the same. Even with millions dead or fleeing, it still felt crowded. The war was not happening at the edge of the city. It was happening everywhere. Titus stood upon the shattered crown of an administratum hab tower that had become his command post by the simple fact that it still stood. Broken statuary lay in chunks around him. The head of some forgotten governor rested upside down near his boots, its stone face eroded by dust and shrapnel. Below, the district spread out in tiers of wreckage and movement, every street and junction a problem of angles, fire lanes and survival. Helm lenses fed him a constant flood of data, distress signals, firing patterns, thermal spikes, collapsing infrastructure, casualty estimates. He studied it all and gave orders with the same cold exactness with which another man might sort bolts on an armory rack. Third squad forward 3 streets and hold the junction at Veneris Causeway. Do not pursue beyond visual range. Fifth squad, break left and destroy the breachhead in the Shrine Quarter. Lieutenant Holt's Auxilia Company is to fall back in stages through the hab trenches and anchor on the rail stations. Gadriel, take the western viaduct and let every man in that quarter see your banner. There was no flourish in his words, no drawn-out rhetoric, no calls for glory. The men around him did not need theatre. They needed decisions. Gadriel dipped his head once, ancient face grim beneath the battered halo of his helm crest. When he descended into the smoke, with the standard of the second company rising above him, men looked up from the filth and ruin of their firing lines and saw more than ceramite and cloth. They saw continuity. They saw the impossible reassurance of the Adeptus Astartes made visible in storm and dust. Bolter reports rolled behind the ancient like thunder behind a storm front. The banner snapped in the furnace wind, the sigils of Ultramar catching green light and bloodlight alike, and the exhausted men of the Auxilia, who had been within a breath of breaking, found themselves standing, straighter as it passed. Lieutenant Marius Holt saw it through a curtain of smoke and almost laughed from the sudden shock of relief. His company had been reduced to less than half strength since the tunnels. The survivors had spent the night fighting withdrawal actions through loading galleries and shattered civic plazas, dragging the wounded when they could and abandoning them when they could not. One squad had been stripped to skeletons by Gauss fire, trying to hold a stairwell. Another had vanished when a service concourse split open beneath them and a procession of silver warriors rose out of the pit. Holt himself had a burn across the left side of his face, where a near strike had boiled his skin beneath the rebreather seal. He had not noticed it properly until the pain returned between firefights. He crouched behind an overturned personnel carrier, las pistol in one hand, borrowed chainsword in the other, while his remaining men traded fire with skeletal shapes advancing through a collapsing arcade. The Necrons came on without haste, their weapons lifting and firing in measured unison. Each green flash was a death sentence. Each kill opened another hole in Holt's line. Then the blue giants emerged through the smoke on the upper causeway. Gadriel's banner rose above them, immense and solemn against the poisoned dawn. Ultramarines moved around it in perfect intervals, bolters lifting, firing, correcting, advancing. Their opening volleys blew silver torsos apart and hurled broken machines from the steps in showers of metal fragments. Men who had been ducking and praying found themselves roaring the Emperor's name and leaning into their rifles once more. "Hold your line!" Holt screamed, voice raw inside the rebreather. "Hold the line! The angels are here!" His men obeyed because there was nothing else left to do, and because the sight above them made cowardice feel suddenly smaller than duty. A local Vox channel crackled to life in Titus's helm. Several voices spoke at once. Panic, rage, clipped military urgency. "Captain, this is Colonel Varus of the Bellastrix Central Defense Grid. The eastern hab rings are collapsing. I need your Astartes at Bastion Kappa now." Another voice cut over him. "No, by the throne. The Shrine District is gone. Send them south. We have breach eruptions in 6 sectors, and no reserves worth naming." A third, older and harsher. "If you are listening, Lord Astartes, High Vortigern has lost all lower transit control. My men are fighting room to room beneath the Pilgrim Avenues. I require immediate reinforcement, or the western line is finished." Mataurus stood beside Titus on the tower roof, helm under one arm. Blood and black dust streaked over his face. He listened to the chorus of mortal desperation with a look that had no softness in it. "They are begging you to divide a blade until it becomes a fistful of needles," he said. "They are begging because they are dying," Titus replied. "And they will continue dying if we waste ourselves plugging every rent in the skin while the knife is still buried in the organ beneath." Silver's fleet liaison officer, a pale man named Revik, wearing void grey battle coat and half a faceplate of augmetics, swallowed before speaking. "My lord, with respect, the city will not survive another cycle of this if the outer quarters are abandoned." Titus turned his head and fixed the mortal with a flat stare. "The city will not survive at all if the main arteries fall. Look." He brought up a tactical spread over the ruined skyline between them. Data runes glimmered through the smoke. Rail arteries, supply avenues, bulk cargo spines, reactor nodes, sub-level access shafts, macro lift junctions. The breach zones flashed in malignant green. "They strike everywhere," Titus said, "but not equally. They burn frontage to force dilution. They pressure the edges so that fools will rush to save them. The decisive ground is here, here, and here." He marked the transit cathedral, the main cargo nexus, the 3 largest sub-rail descent points in the district. Those arteries feed movement, ammunition, and evacuation through the whole central hive belt. Lose them, and every surviving line east and west begins to starve. We hold the arteries. The rest we contest as we are able. Colonel Varus's voice came back over the Vox, shaking with fury. "You are condemning millions." Titus answered without heat. "No, the enemy has done that already. I am deciding which millions may yet live." Silence followed. Bitter silence. Then a clipped acknowledgement from a man who hated the order and understood it anyway. Mataurus bared his teeth in something that was almost approval. "Then let me drive into the breach origin. Give me 1 full squad and we can cut our way down before they thicken the lower routes. Every moment we spend fighting the surface. War is a moment the tomb beneath us." "Orders the next wave. You will have your descent," Titus said, "when the surface lines can survive your absence. They cannot survive this at all. That is not the same thing." Before Mataurus could answer, the eastern district lit up with a chain of detonations so violent that the hab tower beneath them trembled. A distress beacon flared over the great mass transit cathedral of St. Calixtus Transitus, an ancient junction where 12 mag rail lines met beneath a vault of stained ferroglass and iron saints. It had been converted into a fortress through the night. Barricades of freight cars and cargo shrines blocked the main concourse. 2 Lehman Russ tanks had been jammed nose forward beneath the western arch. Hundreds of auxilia and militia held the galleries above. It was also one of the decisive arteries. Titus turned before the liaison officer could speak. "With me." The cathedral had once been built to remind laborers that travel itself was a sacred privilege granted by the Imperium. Its nave was the size of a low hive district, ribbed by iron arches and lined with statues of martyrs whose names had worn away beneath soot and incense. Rail lines ran through its belly like veins. The dome overhead had shattered in several places, letting in grey daylight, ashfall, and the infernal green of weapons fire. Priests had died on the steps. Ticket clerks had died behind marble kiosks. The dead lay where they had fallen, unless something worse had taken them. Titus entered through the western transept as the first barricade line disintegrated. Necron warriors advanced through a storm of lass fire, their bodies jerking as shots punched through rib cages and limbs. Pieces blew off them, sparking and whirling away. It did not matter. Silver bodies crawled back together even as they walked. Hands found severed forearms. Skull halves drew together with stitching bands of emerald light. Men screamed and fired harder, because no sane thing should have been able to stand back up after that much damage. The tanks fired at near point-blank range. Battle cannon shells detonated in the center of the phalanx and filled the nave with thunder. A dozen Necrons vanished in metal rain. Scarabs poured through the smoke, an instant later, a black glittering infestation washing over the lead russ. They swarmed beneath its tracks, into its exhausts, around vision slits and gun housings. The tank commander had just enough time to shout a prayer before the machine began to come apart in layers. Armor plates peeled. Cables vanished. Optics were stripped to black hollows. In seconds, the vehicle was reduced to a sparking carcass, with its crew still screaming inside. Then the Skorpek destroyers hit the line. They came in a blur of scything limbs and piston violence, their forms larger and more grotesque than the warriors behind them, their movements sick with a kind of exultant mechanical hatred. One vaulted the shattered shell of the first tank and landed amid an auxiliary barricade, carving through 6 men before they understood it had arrived. Another split a heavy bolter nest from crown to pelvis, blades whining with the sound of butchered air. The third smashed through a saint statue and took a militia gunner's head off with a backhand slash before ploughing on into the next knot of defenders. Forward, Titus voxed, and his warriors obeyed at once. Bolter fire hammered the nearest destroyer sideways, explosive rounds chewing through living metal. Gadriel crashed into it a heartbeat later, banner staff in one hand, power sword in the other. The blade took the thing through the neck and shoulder. Black fluid and green light burst from the wound. It still tried to rise. Gadriel stamped its spine into the floor and ripped the sword free in a fan of metallic gore. The ultramarines spread into the cathedral like a wedge of blue iron driven through diseased flesh. Holt and what remained of his auxilia company were falling back across the central platform when he saw Titus for the first time up close, not as a distant legend on a parapet, but as a living engine of war moving through the ruin with appalling calm. The captain's bolter spoke once, twice, 3 times, and 3 warriors burst apart. Then Titus was in among them, chainsword revving, shoulder slamming one aside hard enough to break the column behind it. He moved with no wasted motion, every kill a continuation of the last. Matorus led the rightward push into the north gallery, cutting down scarab swarms with disciplined sheets of fire before vaulting the broken remains of a confession kiosk to drive his combat blade into a destroyer's optic cluster. Above him, Gadriel's banner appeared through the smoke on the central stair. Men rallied to it instinctively. Militia who had thrown away their rifles now dug new magazines from dead comrades. Auxilia heavy teams dragged their guns back to firing rails. Priests staggered from cover to scream litanies of hatred with blood running from their mouths. A new shape emerged from the eastern breach. It was taller than the others, broader through the shoulders, its body warped by the destroyer curse into a cruel parody of command. It did not glide like a noble construct. It lunged. Heavy gravitic coils screamed around its spine. Its arms ended in paired hyperphase blades, whose edges shimmered with captive malice. Bronze dynastic adornments hung from it in ragged strips, as though rank itself had been mangled and welded back on by insanity. A cluster of half-shattered warriors drew around it like hounds around a master. Titus felt the battle alter the moment it arrived. The nearest Necrons accelerated, not in speed of limb, but in aggression, as though some signal of slaughter had sharpened within them. The creature fixed its gaze on Gadriel's banner. It leapt. Titus met it halfway across the concourse. The impact cracked the floor under them. Hyperphase blades screamed off his raised sword, shearing sparks and force flares across the smoke. The destroyer Lord Analog twisted with inhuman rapidity, hacking in a storm of murder strokes aimed at throat seals, elbow joints, knee couplings. Titus gave ground one step, no more, then turned the third strike aside and drove his bolter muzzle into the thing's chest. He fired point blank. The mass reactive shell burst inside the torso and blew half its rib assembly out through its back. It kept coming. One blade raked across Titus's shoulder guard and carved a trench through ceramite. Warning runes flashed red across his helm display. He caught the next blow on his vambrace, locked the enemy's arm for a split second, and drove his chainsword across its abdomen in a shrieking arc that spat incandescent fragments in every direction. The destroyer lord lurched, torso half-severed, and tried to bite at him with a face of polished hatred. Titus slammed his forehead into its skull, hard enough to crack the metal brow. He seized one of its bladed arms at the elbow joint, planted a boot against its chest, and tore. Living metal shrieked. The limb came free in a spray of black fluid and snapping light. Before the thing could reorient, Titus buried his sword through its throat assembly and pinned it to the cathedral floor. He twisted. The head came off. The destroyer body convulsed in violent spasms, then lay still at last. All around him, the battle raged on. Yet in that instant of hard-won stillness, Titus saw what had been hidden by the violence. The defensive lines were not being crushed at random. Every retreat lane left open by the enemy curved inward. Every breach, every panic route, every avenue the defenders were being driven toward fed the same directions beneath the city. Toward the subrail descent shafts, toward the old freight plunges, toward the underworks. He opened a command channel at once. "Cornelius, confirm a pattern." The librarian's reply came through layers of battle noise and something colder beneath it. "I am reading signal echoes across captured emissions. Fragments only. Directional impulses. Convergence commands. They are coordinating the assaults around deep sectors beneath the central hive belt." Why? A pause. Titus heard breath, pain, the hum of psychic wards under strain. "I do not know with certainty. A relic, a node, something buried before the Imperium ever named this world. Their commands repeat around one concept again and again. Division. Union. Shard." The word sat in the Vox channel like a drop of poison. Before Titus could press him further, Silver's voice broke in from orbit. It was clipped and strained, stripped of all naval ceremonials. "Captain, we have new void contacts beyond the moon belts. Dozens at first mark, more resolving behind them. Crescent profiles, engine signatures inconsistent with the tomb beneath the surface. This is not an isolated awakening. The planet-side complex is only one element of a greater hostile approach." Titus looked up through the broken dome of the cathedral. Ash fell from the heavens in a slow grey rain. Somewhere above that veil, beyond blind defense lasers and the hidden sun, the wider war was coming. Below, the dead were still climbing. Gadriel reached him through drifting smoke. Banner darkened with soot and blood. Mataurus joined them from the north gallery, helm now sealed, armor splashed with oil and gore. Around them, human defenders were shoring up the line, dragging ammunition, kicking apart still twitching Necron remains, gathering their courage in the shadow of giants. Mataurus spoke first. "You see it now?" "Yes," Titus said. "They want the underworks." "Yes. Then we strike downward at once." Titus looked over the cathedral and beyond it, over the broken avenues where men still fought and died by the thousand, over the long arterial roads that fed the hives, heart over the districts already judged unsalvageable, and the ones still hanging by threads of faith and ammunition. When he spoke, his voice carried across command channels, across Fleet Net, across every surviving line officer and every Astartes squad still killing in the streets. This war has two fronts. The hives above do not fall. The world below is breached and will be contested. Gadriel, you hold the arteries and make this city live 1 hour longer each hour you are given. Mataris, prepare a descent force. Cornelius comes with us. Silver, keep the skies from closing and watch the moon belts. We defend the living above, and we descend into the tomb beneath to cut the dead out by the root. No one answered with cheers. There was no strength left in Nova Magnar for that. There was only obedience, iron and immediate. The green dawn burned on, and the war for the surface became the war for the grave beneath it. The way down began in heat and industry and the familiar exhaustion of a world still trying to pretend it had not already been mortally wounded. Beneath Bellatrix Magna, below the freight cathedra and the shell foundries and the transit arteries where men still fought and died to hold the hiveskin together, Titus led his chosen force into a maintenance shaft large enough to swallow a baneblade. It had once carried magma bled from the mantle toward the refineries above. Now its conduit valves were dead, its machine shrines cold, and its iron ribs sweated with old condensation and fresh ash from the war raging overhead. The only light came from helm lenses, lumen globes, and the intermittent furnace glow of distant ruptured ducts far below. The kill team moved in disciplined files through the shaft throat, Titus at the fore, Mataris on his right, Gadriel on his left, the Ancient having surrendered the visible line of the surface defense to veteran sergeants, and descended with the company standard furled against its casing, as though even in the deep dark he would not leave the soul of the company behind. Cornelius walked several paces to the rear of Titus, psychic hood whispering with restrained force. Around them came a hard core of Ultramarines veterans in scarred ceramite, then the mortal attachments, voidsmen in sealed naval armor carrying shot cannons and cutlasses for tunnel work, and the underhive militias of Nova Magnar, men born in the maintenance labyrinths who knew old service routes, forgotten cisterns and utility burrows the administratum no longer remembered existed. Lieutenant Marius Holt walked with them, rebreather mask hissing, left cheek bound beneath synth skin and field dressings, where Gauss light had kissed him and left his flesh seared. He had argued to be included, not from courage, but because every route map above the sealed sectors ended in lies, and because the men under his command would follow no one else into the dark. Titus had allowed it without comment. A commander spent lives where they were useful. They passed first through the lower maintenance grids of the hive, where reality still possessed the decency to remain comprehensible. Pipes, cable forests, loading cradles, machine altars with brass teeth and occluded Saint plates, dead servitors slumped in alcoves where power loss had left them as mute carrion. Then the force reached the first of the old seals. It stood across a descending service arch, a wall of adamant shutters banded in red Mechanicus sigils, so ancient that half the warning script had been worn smooth by time and mineral sweat. Rusted chains had been blessed and hung across the hatch in ritual denial. Wax stamps the size of a man's torso still clung to the iron, stamped with cogwheel crests from forge authorities that had ceased to exist before Nova Magnar's current hive belts had been built. Holt looked at the seal and made the sign of the Aquila without seeming to realize he had done it. My grandfather spoke of these places. He said over the squad channel, voice thick behind his mask. Every hive has them. Lower doors no one opens. Corridors the tech priests brick over and forget. We were told they housed rad floods and machine blasphemies. Mataris placed one gauntlet on the hatch. Perhaps they did. Cornelius closed his eyes. The air around him seemed to tighten. Something has opened paths below this one. The seals are a lie now. The dark beneath them is awake. Titus gave a single nod. Melter charges were set. The old Mechanicus curses burned away in white fire. Iron bulged, ran and split. The hatch collapsed inward with a shriek of tortured metal and a gust of cold so profound that several of the mortal soldiers recoiled as if struck. It should not have been cold. They were descending toward the mantle through industrial veins and magma architecture. Yet the black beyond the seal breathed a chill that seemed older than weather and deeper than stone. It smelled of dust never touched by, air of old tombs, dead metal, and the thin copper whisper of spent blood. They entered anyway. The shaft beyond was not imperial. That was clear at once, and it became clearer with every meter of descent. Human engineers had found it in some forgotten age and built around it, caged it in support columns, bridged it with platforms, fed power through its flanks, and named the whole arrangement infrastructure. But beneath the additions, the original shape remained. Walls too smooth for excavation, angles too exact, surfaces that took no rust, an architecture that refused ornament because it had no need of beauty and no tolerance for imperfection. The force moved downward through old magma conduits, cut across impossible galleries. They crossed ossuary catacombs, where the bones of long-dead workers had been stacked in alcoves beneath prayer plates and hazard runes. They passed into voids of black metal, where no human mason had ever set tool to stone. One gallery curved left and continued curving for far longer than the dimensions of the hive should have allowed. Another seemed close enough to touch at its far end, and yet took 20 minutes to cross. A stair of smooth silver steps descended through open darkness, without central support, spiraling down around a shaft that had no visible floor and no echo when pebbles were cast into it. The silence became a living thing, not the ordinary silence of underground places, where distant pipes knock and old air murmurs, and a man can hear the working noises of buried infrastructure. This was a silence with intent. It swallowed footfalls. It drank the clink of buckles and the hiss of rebreathers until the whole force seemed to be advancing through a sealed dream. Men began speaking only to assure themselves that sound still existed. Each voice came back to them, dampened and wrong. Time lost its edge down there. Chronometers lagged, then leapt ahead. A voidsman swore they had walked in a straight line for 2 hours, though Holt insisted the route should have bent back toward the transit route 6 levels earlier. Gadriel halted once and looked behind them, only to find the arch they had passed through no longer visible, the corridor stretching back into blackness with no sign of the fork they had used. "Geometry is unstable," Cornelius murmured. "Not physically, perceptually. This place was built to dislocate confidence." Mataras snorted. "Then it is succeeding with the mortals." It was. The first men broke in the ossuary galleries. They found the labor gang hanging beneath the black arches, where the catacombs opened into an older chamber. 50 men at least, perhaps more, all in the torn remains of overalls and drill harnesses from the lower excavation crews. They had not merely been killed, they had been opened and arranged. Skin hung from the arches in strips like devotional banners. Flayed bodies dangled head down from taloned hooks of living metal extruded from the ceiling, their ribs spread and gleaming, entrails uncoiled in long wet strands that brushed the floor. Some still twitched with the last mindless tremors of ruined flesh. Most had no faces left. Their skulls shone white through stringy crimson residue. The black arches themselves were not arches at all, Holt realized with a surge of nausea. They were extruded limbs of the tomb architecture, grown outward to display the dead as warnings. One of the tunnel militiamen made a choking noise and tore his mask away to vomit. Another dropped his weapon and backed into the wall, whispering the Emperor's name with mounting speed until the words became useless noise. A voidsman raised his shotgun and fired both barrels into one of the hanging corpses, as if killing it again might make the sight less real. The blast filled the chamber with gobbets of flesh and the hard ring of pellets striking metal. Several more mortals started shouting at once. "Silence," Titus said. He did not shout. He did not need to. The word cut through the panic with more force than a gunshot. The men quieted in ragged stages, breathing, whimpering, metal settling. Titus turned his helm toward the closest cluster of shaken soldiers. "Fear is acceptable. Disorder is not. You will master yourselves now." A few nodded at once. One did not. The voidsman who had fired into the corpse was still shaking his head, eyes white and huge behind the grime on his face. "No," he whispered. "No, this is cursed. This is not war. This is hell. We should go back. Throne preserve us. We should go back." Mataras took one step toward him. "If you turn your back in this place, you will die before you have taken 3 paces." Gadriel's tone was rougher, but not unkind. "Then die facing forward, voidsman. That is at least a clean ending." The man stared at him, perhaps trying to decide whether the ancient mocked him. There was nothing mocking in Gadriel's scarred face. Holt moved too. His men, and hauled the nearest one upright by his chest rig. "You heard the captain. Weapons up, eyes front. Panic later if you live long enough." They resumed the advance. The clash between Gadriel and Mataras came in the no-go sectors below the catacombs, where red Mechanicus ward plates had been welded across older passages in a desperate geometry of prohibition. Some had been pried aside from beneath, their edges curled and clawed. Others stood intact, but led nowhere the squad could still trust. The only reliable progress lay through a sequence of intersecting galleries that narrowed, widened, dipped, and looped with insulting disregard for expected structure. Mataras wanted speed. Every halt angered him. Every sweep of corners, every checked auspex reading, every pause to verify direction seemed to him another gift granted to the enemy. "They are marshalling below us even now," he said, after the force had spent precious minutes crossing a chamber full of lightless obelisks that bent censor, returns into nonsense. "We drive hard, Captain. We strike the convergence before it hardens. Every moment of caution costs blood above. And every moment of haste may cost us the force sent to cut the throat," Gadriel replied. "These paths are not trenches. One blind rush, and we will vanish into whatever mad geometry birthed them." Mataras turned on him. "Steady advance is another word for surrender when the enemy multiplies faster than you move. And recklessness is another word for stupidity when you cannot see the blade coming." The veterans around them held formation and said nothing, though the tension sharpened the air. Holt felt it keenly. So did the mortal soldiers, who watched the towering blue figures with the strange unease of men, realizing that even demigods could disagree inside the dark. Titus stopped. The whole column stopped with him. He turned first to Mataras. "You will not mistake impatience for courage," then to Gadriel, "nor caution for wisdom." Both warriors held his gaze. Titus's voice remained low and level. "You are each correct and each dangerous. We advance with speed where the ground is knowable. We advance with discipline where it is not. The enemy does not need us to quarrel. This tomb is already doing that work for them." Neither replied at once. Then Gadriel bowed his head slightly. "As you command." Mataras gave a curt nod. "Captain." It was enough. It had to be. Further down they found the excavation crews. The chamber had once been a mining breakpoint, where Nova Magnar and labor teams had cut exploratory shafts into a deeper seam, and then, by some fatal misfortune, opened a way into the buried tomb. Drills lay where they had been dropped. Cargo crawlers rested on dead treads. Auspex units blinked quietly to themselves in pools of grey dust. The men who had worked there were gone in every meaningful sense, though the outlines of them remained. Dozens of shadows stained the walls. Not soot, not paint. The scorched impressions of bodies atomized where they had stood. A man bracing a cutter. Another turning an alarm. A pair close together behind a loader, perhaps trying to hide. On the floor lay only boots, belt buckles, teeth, and the fine residual ash of instant annihilation. One wall had taken the full sweep of gorse fire and been reduced to a drifting slope of powdered stone. The shadows burned into the surviving sections looked like an audience witnessing their own extinction. Cornelius knelt among the residue and touched 2 fingers to the dust. Psychic frost spread over his gauntlet. "They opened the wrong door," he said. Holt swallowed audibly. "And then what killed them kept going." "No," Cornelius said, head tilted as if listening to distant speech. "It waited. It killed those nearest. It withdrew. It wanted the path clear." Titus studied the chamber's rear wall where excavation charges had breached into older metal. On the exposed surface beyond the cut lay runes unlike the active glyphs of the Necron constructs they had fought above. These were older, more formal, laid in ordered rings around a recessed seam, sealed by some black mineral that drank the light. Human survey marks had been painted over them long ago. Crude arrows, inventory notations, drill priority sigils, layers of ignorance over significance. Amantar, Titus thought, and felt the shape of the hunt beginning to reveal itself. The thing below was not merely driving an invasion, it was searching. It was clawing downward towards something buried more deeply still. Before he could voice the thought, the dark moved. Not ahead, beneath. The floor under the rear of the column bulged like skin over a striking serpent. A voidsman had time only to scream once before a silver shape erupted through the metal beneath him, all coiled limbs and flensing blades. It hit him at the waist and cut upward, splitting him into a fan of blood and armor scraps. A second Ophidian destroyer burst from the wall to the left, phasing through solid matter as though stone were fog. A third dropped from the ceiling, tail segments lashing, green eyes blazing in the black. The chamber became murder at arm's length. Bolter fire thundered too close for comfort, the detonations slamming heat and fragment spray back into the squad as the destroyers twisted through the blasts. They were long and serpentine, their lower bodies a nest of living blades and burrowing segments, their upper forms leaner than the Scorpex, but no less rabid. They moved with impossible speed, vanishing through floor and wall, reappearing where a heartbeat before there had been only shadow. One hit the tunnel militia line and opened 3 men in a single weaving pass. Another skewered a voidsman through the throat and dragged him screaming into the metal of the wall as if solid matter had become water. His cries cut off abruptly. "Close ranks!" Titus barked. He met the nearest destroyer head-on. Its blades flashed for his joints and throat. He took one strike on his pauldron, another on his raised sword, then drove forward inside its reach and hammered his chainsword into the creature's chest. Teeth shrieked across living metal. Black fluid fountained over his breastplate. The destroyer twisted, trying to phase away, and Titus locked his grip and tore it open from sternum to pelvis until its body came apart in convulsing sections. Gadriel anchored the left, standard casing clipped across his back, while he fought with sword and combat blade in brutal, economical arcs. Mataris became a blur of counter-violence, chasing the flicker signs of emerging Ophidians and striking the instant their bodies resolved. One of the Ultramarines lost half his helm and an eye to a whipping tail blade, and still fired point blank into the destroyer's face until its skull burst apart. The darkness worked with the enemy. Lumen globes died. Auspex readings turned to static. Men fired at movement and struck walls. The chamber became a maze of screams, ricochets, green flares, and the constant wet tearing of flesh. Cornelius planted his force staff into the floor and opened his mind. The psychic pulse that burst from him was invisible to mortal sight, but every living man in the chamber felt it as a pressure behind the eyes and a taste of iron on the tongue. The Ophidians shrieked in binharic distortion as the pulse caught them half-phased. For one precious moment, they became wholly present. The Ultramarines killed without hesitation. When the last of the destroyers stopped moving, the chamber fell back into that same obscene silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of the surviving mortals and the drip of blood off ceramite onto black metal. Cornelius swayed. Titus caught him by the forearm before he could fall. "There is a hierarchy below," the librarian said through clenched teeth. "Not one will, many, layered command minds, lesser predators answering greater killers, and deeper than them all, one directing hunger toward a single point. They are converging on a central chamber." "Amantar," said Gadriel. Cornelius's gaze drifted toward the sealed black seam at the rear of the excavation site. "Yes, and whatever lies beyond that older door." They forced the breach. Not by melter this time. The black mineral resisted heat in ways it should not have. Instead, the Ultramarines used cutting charges to shear away the human excavation braces around it, then levered the entire section inward with servo strength and grinding iron shrieks. Behind it lay a passage older than the current hive, older than the first Imperial surveyors, perhaps older than human claim on Nova Magnar altogether. The walls within were not fully Necron, or not in the form Titus had seen elsewhere. Black stone ribbed with veins of dormant metal, relief carvings worn almost smooth by eras, beyond counting. Fractured plinths, bearing the remains of a script no living Imperial scholar would have recognized at a glance. Someone had found this place long before the current civilization of Nova Magnar and had built around it, or hidden it, or worshipped it. The distinctions scarcely mattered now. At the passage end stood a dais of black stone encircled by broken pylons. In its center rested a cradle or prison, empty now but shaped for something not large and terribly important. Around it, recent marks scored the floor where living metal had scraped and cut. Titus saw the logic all at once. This was no random awakening. The dead empire below had risen because something buried deeper than the hive belts, deeper perhaps than the Imperium's first claim to the world, had drawn them into fury. "Amantar hunts a relic," he said. Cornelius's expression tightened. "No, not a relic. A fragment. A presence. Something old enough that even the tomb things above treat it with a kind of terror." Before any man could speak further, the far wall of the chamber began to move. The stone did not split. It irised. Concentric rings the size of hab blocks rotated inward with soundless precision, each layer retracting into the next until a cyclopean gate yawned open before them. Cold poured out in a palpable tide. The dark beyond was immense, a chamber large enough to bury armies. From that blackness came ranks of destroyers, not shambling, not screaming, not even running. They marched, Scorpex in butcher ranks, Ophidians flowing in flanking coils, heavier forms behind them, hunched and terrible, their weapons folded close, dozens, scores, more than the chamber should have been able to contain. All advancing in absolute silence, green eyes burning like a constellation of hateful stars. At their head, far back in the dark, where distance went strange and scale lost meaning, a taller silhouette watched without moving. Holt felt his mouth go dry behind the rebreather. Around him, the surviving mortals began to breathe faster, too fast, the animal sound of men at the edge of collapse. Titus raised his bolter. "Line formation," he said. The first rank of destroyers crossed the threshold, and the buried dark of Nova Magnar came for them in perfect silence. By the time the ash storms spread across the inner continents, and the first relief flotillas began dying in the dark between worlds, Nova Magnar had ceased to be a single battlefield and become a lesson in scale. It was not alone. The Vespertor front had never been a line in any sane military sense. It was a wound field spread across star systems, manufactorial chains, pilgrim routes, fuel depots, grain worlds, shrine worlds, moon foundries and void stations lashed together by convoys and prayer. 100 worlds fed a dozen war worlds. A dozen war worlds fed 3 fortress routes. One broken corridor could starve a fleet. One dead moon dock could cripple a subsector's ability to move munitions. Men spoke of fronts because the human mind liked the lie of shape and boundary. In truth, it was a burning web, and now fire was running through every strand. In the command vault beneath the battered strike cruiser, hololithic stars burned in the dark like coals suspended over a grave. Nova Magnar rotated at the center of the display, its continents marked by fresh green infestations, red defense grids, amber logistics arteries, and black zones where contact had simply vanished. Beyond it, the wider theater spread in concentric volumes. Shipping routes flickered and died. Astropathic relay stations pulsed with distress. Convoys fell dark between one system and the next, their transponder ghosts freezing in place before the Picts vanished forever. The Vespata front looked less like a campaign and more like a body developing gangrene. Commodore Gaius Silver stood at the edge of the projection in void grey warplate, his face more lined than it had been a day earlier. The skin around his augmetic eye had taken on the grey cast of a man who had stopped sleeping because sleep no longer purchased enough clarity to justify the weakness. Fleet officers worked behind him in murmuring knots, passing data slates and casualty runes with the numb precision of men already buried in numbers too large to feel. Titus watched the theater update itself in killing increments. He said nothing, and no one mistook his silence for uncertainty. The first countermeasures had been ugly in the way all immediate Imperial responses were ugly. Labor cohorts stripped from shell lines and refinery floors had been issued rifles and marched into breach sectors with 2 hours of instruction and a priest to make them die in orderly fashion. Militia reserve roles had been emptied from the hive belts and fed into attrition trenches around transit arteries. Fleet armsmen, who should have remained aboard Voidcraft, were sent groundside to hold loading bastions and macro rail depots, because no one else remained to do it. Whole shifts of manufactorium workers were redirected from production to corpse disposal, barricade construction, and ammunition haulage. At the order of the governor, and under threat of summary execution, districts not yet breached were put onto war famine schedules so that the surviving core hives could keep feeding men to the lines. Billions were being moved by decree, stamp, shouted order, and lasgun butt. Billions. Men from grain lifts, men from sump rigs, men from orbital docks, men from hab slums, men from cargo shrines, men from clan barracks in the ash wastes, boys whose first uniform was their burial shroud in waiting. Veterans with bad lungs and missing fingers dragged back into service because the front had become wider than decency. Every ledger on Nova Magnar now ended in a body count, and still it was not enough. Silver reached into the hololith and expanded the outer theater. A convoy route flared, then washed crimson. This was the Gathalam supply chain, he said. His voice was dry and level, which made the content worse. 43 freighters, 6 munitions haulers, 3 Prometheum carriers, escorted by 2 light cruisers and a destroyer screen. They translated in system on the far side of the moonbelts. Half an hour later, we lost formal contact. Debris augers recovered thermal bloom patterns consistent with boarding torpedoes and particle lancing. There were no survivors. He closed that display and opened another. This one showed a merchant column burning in the void, long civilian hulls drifting on breached spines, while crescent shadows moved between them with insect precision. Vos Peregrine Run, pilgrim traffic and food levy, interdicted between relay stations. The enemy did not simply destroy them. It cut power, boarded, took what it wanted, and then used the hulks as ambush beacons for the relief corvette sent to investigate. Another image. A station, half collapsed, its docking, arms torn open to vacuum. Another. A cargo moon with fires along the rim. Another. Naval armsmen fighting corridor to corridor under flickering lumen strips, while something silver and skeletal advanced through decompression frost. Boarding raids have increased on all approach vectors to Nova Magnar. Merchant columns are becoming funeral pyres. Relief fleets cannot arrive in strength because they are being skinned apart in transit. What comes for this world has already reached beyond it. No one in the chamber answered immediately. Even among seasoned officers, there was a point at which information became a form of punishment. Gadriel stood near Titus with the stillness of an old executioner. The ancient's armor was newly scarred from the descent, and his expression had hardened since the underworks. He looked at the burning convoy signs as though trying to decide whether hatred alone could bridge vacuum. Mataurus, by contrast, wore his anger openly. He had the look of a warrior forced to remain in a room while the enemy still lived outside it. Cornelius stood apart from them all, one hand braced on the edge of the command lectern. Blood had dried in fine lines beneath his nose and at the corner of one eye. The strain of touching the machine mines below had left his face drawn and pale, but there was no softness in him. Fear had burned down into function. Titus let the silence stretch until every man in the chamber had been made to sit with the full breadth of the situation. Then he spoke. State the planetary position. The governor of Nova Magnar had been present for the first third of the council, before a seizure of terror and indignation sent him from the chamber under escort. In his place remained the men who actually fought the war, a knot of senior logisticians, 2 naval liaison masters, 3 auxiliary generals, the Magos delegate of the lower manufactorial combines, representatives from the Hive Defense Corps. None of them looked pleased to be there. Most looked half dead. General Castor Vale of the Nova Magnoran Auxilia stepped forward when no one else moved quickly enough. He was a big man gone thick through the chest and neck with age and service, his scalp shaved close, his greatcoat dark with rain, soot, and old blood. One side of his mouth had been drawn into a white knot by some ancient burn. He did not carry himself like a court officer. He carried himself like a siege gun that had learned to speak. "The Western Ash continents are unstable and getting worse," Vale said. 3 outer hive chains have lost sub-level integrity. We can hold the northern refinery corridor for perhaps another day if ammunition keeps reaching it. The southern grain plateaus are in full evacuation, which means they are effectively already gone. If the enemy takes the deep loaders there, it will have straight routes under half the surviving agri-belts. He pointed to the central continent, where the brightest knot of war, runes, still pulsed. The core manufactoria are holding, because your ultramarines hold the transit spine, and because men are dying faster, there than the dead machines can presently replace the ground. If either condition changes, the heartland fails. A Magos intoned Binharic data through a Vox grill and an attendant translated. Reactor output falling. Ammunition consumption unsustainable. Macro rail throughput approaching collapse. Food stores being redirected from non-essential populations. Estimated labor losses unacceptable but recoverable only if the core industrial sanctum survived. Silver added the naval truth to it. Orbital stations could be stripped for guns, men and munitions, but doing so would blind local defense and make subsequent fleet resupply nearly impossible. Outer moons could be abandoned in order to concentrate void power over the inner belts, but those moons housed promethium processing, ore transfer and astropathic relay chains. Preserve the stations and the surface starved. Strip them and the sky opened. Every choice was a mutilation. Mataurus broke first. Then we stop pretending we can save the shell and strike the brain. We cut downward into every major nexus below the hives and destroy the command lattice driving the awakenings. Every company, every reserve, every deployment that is not directly preserving an artery is wasted. Gadriel's head turned a fraction. And while we bleed ourselves in the dark, who holds the billions above? The billions above are already dying. They are still dying for time. Time is not worthless. They are dying for indecision. Titus cut through them before the argument could root deeper. Enough. He turned to Cornelius. Speak. The librarian lifted his head slowly, as though doing so required effort. When he spoke, the chamber seemed to cool around the words. The machine signal structure beneath Nova Magnar is spreading. It is not local in any useful sense. I have intercepted fragments across the underworks, the upper breachheads, and now through void static, beyond the moon belts. It moves faster than our command can answer, because it is not relayed as men relay. It propagates. Command impulses travel from tomb to construct to vessel to awakened node in cascading harmonics. Amentar is not merely directing attacks, it is binding disparate hosts into shared intent. He closed his eyes, and for a moment his face looked like that of a man listening at the wall of his own grave. It seeks a convergence. The assaults are synchronized around buried locations, old nodes, sealed sectors and relic sites. Whatever lies beneath Nova Magnar is part of a design larger than the world. I believe the same command web is touching other worlds across the front. A hiss of disbelief came from one of the human officers. Vale did not bother with disbelief. He went straight to anger. So while we debate logistics, some Xeno's Butcher King is using this whole theater as a hunting ground. Yes, said Cornelius. The answer was so simple, it made several men flinch. Titus looked again at the maps. He had seen this shape before, though not with this enemy and not on this scale. Wars were often decided when lesser commanders still believed they had options. The moment the truth of insufficiency became undeniable, they reached for miracles. But a commander who reached for miracles usually handed victory to the enemy wrapped in prayer and optimism. He gave his decision without preface. The outer continents will not be reinforced. The chamber reacted as if he had drawn a blade across the table. General Vale took one step forward. Another auxiliary commander swore under his breath. A naval liaison went pale. Gadriel's jaw tightened visibly. Mataris said nothing at all, which in itself was agreement. Titus continued over them. The orbital stations in the inner belt will be partially stripped, not wholly, abandoned. Surface survival is to be concentrated around the core manufactorial heartland, the main transit cathedra, the subrail arteries, and the major descent points. Grain plateaus outside recoverable range are to be written off. Outer hive chains beyond the defensible routes will conduct fighting withdrawals if they can, and stand to delay if they cannot. Fleet interdiction becomes priority in high orbit and beyond the moon belts. Ground doctrine becomes attrition above and decapitation below. We preserve the heart. Everything else buys time or dies. Vale stared at him, as though seeing not a savior in blue plate, but a particularly articulate executioner. You are condemning the frontier belts, the general said. Titus met the man's gaze without evasion. Yes. The nakedness of that answer struck harder than any attempt at consolation would have done. Vale's burn twisted pale with fury. Maps over men, then. Tonnage over blood. You Astartes always speak of duty, when what you mean is arithmetic. Mataris took a step, but Titus raised one gauntlet, and the veteran halted. Wars are lost exactly that way, Titus said. When men in command mistake compassion for distribution, you spread strength evenly because each plea sounds equally worthy. You answer every scream. You save nothing. The enemy is not asking our permission to create mass graves. It is creating them already. My duty is not to pretend I can prevent all death. My duty is to decide where death will purchase survival." The words landed like stones in a burial pit. Vale looked as if he wanted to strike him. Gadriel looked as if he wanted Titus to be wrong. But neither of them spoke. They could not, because the maps glowed with the shape of the truth. Reinforce everything, and everything failed. Cut losses now, and something living might remain at the center. At last, Matoris broke the silence. "It is necessary." Gadriel turned his head slightly toward him. The ancient's voice came rough and low. "Necessary things are often the filthiest. Yes, and we will do them anyway. Yes." The old warrior held Titus's gaze for a moment longer. There was grief in his expression, and contempt, but not disobedience. "Then give the orders, Captain." So the answer of the Imperium began to take its final shape. Silver was granted authority to turn the near void into a killing belt. Fast pickets would harry incoming crescent craft beyond the moon belts, even knowing many would not return. Merchant lanes would be collapsed into escorted convoys or abandoned entirely. Orbital stations would bleed guns, munitions and armsmen into the inner war, while maintaining just enough shield and auger coverage to keep the sky from disappearing. If ships had to die, they would die buying hours, not merely honor. On the surface, attrition lines thickened around the core. Transit cathedra became fortresses. Freight avenues became trench systems. Mag lift shafts were mined. Shrine avenues were walled. Men from agribelts and shell lines were fed into the grinder, where the lines still mattered, and the hives beyond recall were ordered to delay, burn stores, demolish descent routes, and die hard enough to matter. Below, Titus would strike again and again into the buried command nexuses. Not random descents, not blind heroics. Kill team thrusts at signal hearts, gate clusters, relay sepulchres, and ancient nodes from which the dead empire coordinated its waking war. If Nova Magnar could not be spared from beneath, then the roots of the invasion would be cut one chamber at a time. Orders flew from the chamber in tight-coded chains, every one of them a sentence passed on men Titus would never meet. The council should have ended there. It did not. A Vox adept at the rear of the chamber jerked upright so suddenly that his chair toppled behind him. He clawed at one side of his headset, eyes wide, listening to a report from elsewhere in the theater. Silver turned sharply. "What is it?" The adept swallowed once. His answer came out thin and wrong. "Confirmation from the Seraphon Reach picket line, Lord Commodore. Delayed by astropathic storm and signal corruption. A world-designated Charnel's Rest suffered simultaneous tomb emergencies during evacuation. Survivors describe a hostile manifestation accompanying the Necron advance. A figure, vast, black as a lightless void, wreathed in shadow. It moved through armor and men alike. All Auspex returns failed in proximity." Cornelius closed his eyes at once, as if the words themselves carried pain. The adept continued, voice breaking now. The relay attached witness transcripts. They call it the Reaper of Dust. Fleet command there confirms entire regiments fled contact. The Necron host was acting in coordinated support of the manifestation. Imperial priests have declared it a god shard. No one moved. Even the ship seemed quieter around that. "Report." Silver looked toward Titus. Gadriel's face had become a slab of old stone. Matoris's expression did not change, but something in the set of his shoulders hardened further. Vale, who had spent the last minutes hating the captain's decisions, now looked at the hololith as if ordinary hatred had become too small to contain what was coming. Cornelius opened his eyes, and there was a depth of dread in them that no mortal in the chamber could have mistaken. "The pattern is confirmed," he said. "Nova Magnar is not the center. It is one claw of the design. Amintar is hunting fragments across the front." No one asked fragments of what. They already knew. Outside the command vault, the guns of Nova Magnar still fired into ash and smog, while the dead climbed from the earth and the fleets died between stars. Inside, beneath the light of burning worlds, the men charged with holding the line understood at last that they were not merely fighting a tomb awakening or even an invasion. They were watching the hand of something far older reach across the Vespata front, gathering itself from the dark. The first volleys were fired into a silence so deep that the bolter detonations seemed an insult, cast into a cathedral of the dead. The Cyclopean gate had finished irising open, and from the abyss beyond it, the destroyers came in ordered ranks, their madness caged into obedience by a will greater and fouler than their own. They advanced through black vapor and cold green lumen haze, without battle cry or metallic shriek, a procession of annihilation framed by walls large enough to humble cathedra. The chamber beyond the threshold was no simple vault. It was a nexus, a confluence of tomb roads and command ways sunk deep beneath the hive skin, where ancient geometries met beneath the weight of a whole world. Titus raised his sword, and the ultramarines opened fire. Mass reactive rounds crossed the threshold in a storm of explosive light. The first rank of Scorpec forms blew apart at chest and neck, silver limbs spinning loose in the darkness. Ophidian coils were torn open mid-lunge and cast writhing across the black floor. Yet the ranks behind them did not falter. They came on through their own fragments. Worse than that, Titus saw at once what made these things different from those that had erupted through Bellatrix Magna and Saint Calixtus. The destroyers of the Nexus were wrong even by Necron standards. Their living metal was scored with crawling glyph work that pulsed in sickly viridian flashes. Some had fused enemy remains into themselves as trophies or contamination. Flayed strips of human hide had been drawn across their shoulders and rib cages in mockery of organic life. Bronze dynastic sigils had been hacked away and replaced by crude, repeated marks, circles broken by descending blades, a slaughter creed burned into necrodermis by obsession. They fought with an uglier hunger than ordinary phalanxes. Precision remained, but it had curdled into something closer to rabid purpose. They threw themselves into fire gaps that should have been tactically unsound. They accepted mutilation in exchange for one more meter of advance. They clawed through the wrecks of their own kind to reach living flesh faster. "The proximity is changing them," Cornelius voxed, strain thick in his voice. "The Necrosaurs command rot. It is not mere hierarchy, it is infection." A destroyer burst through the front rank and took a militia gunner apart from groin to throat before Gadriel split its skull with a downward cut. Another came through the smoke on a whip of segmented limbs and dragged a voidsman screaming into the dark. The return fire from Holt's surviving tunnel men grew ragged, then frantic. "Steady," Titus snapped. "Disciplined volleys. Kill the front, mine the threshold, advance on the left." He moved as he commanded, driving straight into the breachhead with his veterans at his shoulders. The threshold became a grinder of ceramite and silver bone, of detonating shells and shrieking blades. Titus hacked one Scorpec down across the thorax, turned aside a hyperphase scythe that would have gutted Holt, and smashed the butt of his bolter into an Ophidian face, hard enough to cave it inward before firing through the ruin. Beside him, Mataras cut with murderous economy, not wasting motion, only redirecting violence into deeper violence. Gadriel held the narrower rightward choke, where the threshold pinched between black pylons, and the old warrior became a wall the destroyers had to kill by pieces if they were to pass. They almost did. The press intensified with unnatural speed. More ranks came from the vast chamber beyond the gate, and behind them, farther back, taller shapes watched. Not warriors, directors. Titus caught glimpses only, long-limbed and stooped beneath crowns of antennae and optic clusters, things that moved among the destroyers with the chill authority of keepers walking kennels. One raised a staff crowned in spinning glyph rings, A burst of invisible force slammed through the chamber, and every destroyer on the line convulsed as though struck by revelation. Then they came forward harder. "Charges on the inner pylons," Titus ordered. "We break the nexus while we have the throat of it." A team of combat engineers attached from the Ballastric sub-level corps ran under cover of ultramarine fire, hauling melter satchels and grav cutters. Men died before they crossed half the ground. One was sheared from shoulder to hip by an Ophidian lunge and folded around his own spilling organs before the satchel even struck the floor. Another made it to the pylon base, slapped the charge into place, and was atomized by Gauss fire so intense it burned his silhouette into the black metal behind him. Still, the survivors kept running, because Titus had told them the Nexus must die, and because men in the Imperium often obeyed most completely when... The order sounded very much like a death sentence. A voice entered every active Vox channel. It did not arrive with static or signal corruption. It arrived pristine, cold, perfectly articulated in a register too old to be called merely mechanical. "Organic Commander," it said, and the Gothic was formal in a way no living human used any longer, each syllable honed like a ceremonial blade. "Your persistence is noted. Your trespass remains intolerable." Titus did not look up. He gutted an advancing destroyer, kicked the twitching halves aside, and replied while firing into the next rank. "Identify." There was the ghost of amusement in the answer, though it was amusement of the kind a dissecting savant might feel toward an animal that had learned to open a gate latch. "I am the memory that instructs your extinction. I am custodian to dynasties beneath your species' comprehension. I am the hand by which the holy dead are reclaimed from the filth of your habitation. You stand upon a sacred dead empire, ape thing. You and all your kind are infestation, nesting in sepulchre dust." A cryptech, Titus thought. Perhaps more than that. A node of command wearing a single voice. The transmission continued as warriors burned and died beneath ultramarine fire. "Withdraw into your hives. Suffocate in your smoke. Your bones will enrich nothing. The worlds you call yours were old when your son was still nursing stone." Mataurus spat a curse over the squad net. "Let me find the thing speaking." "Not yet," Titus said. Cornelius staggered as if the words themselves had carried force. "There are data caskets in the rear galleries. I can feel them pulsing under the command traffic, fragments of their signal archive. If we take them intact..." "Take them," Titus said. "We did not descend to kill only bodies." He directed a half squad through the leftward arcade, where the nexus opened into subsidiary chambers lined by black monolith, housings, and old command plinths. The fighting there became intimate and filthy. Necron guardians met them in ranks that should have been orderly, but instead hacked forward with a zeal that bordered on frenzy. One threw itself bodily onto an ultramarine's chainsword and held the blade trapped in its ribcage long enough for another to drive a gorse bayonet through the marine's thigh plating. Titus cut both down, then waded over their remains into the chamber beyond. The room looked like an observatory built by a race that had once believed the stars were things to be catalogued before they were butchered. Fossilized star maps covered the walls in vast relief spirals, their old celestial pathways, fossil-hard and glittering with dormant minerals. Imperial relics lay smashed underfoot, where excavation teams or pious looters had once intruded and been punished for it. Shrine plaques, reliquary cages, a bronze aquila snapped in half. St. Bones spilled from cracked crystal tubes and ground to powder under ceramite boots. At the center stood 3 data caskets extruded from the floor in black crystal and living metal, each alive with slow pulses of green script. A towering construct moved to intercept them. It was taller even than the destroyer forms outside, narrow-waisted and regal in a hideous way, its body draped in execution chains and segmented blade veins. Its face was a polished death mask, split by a vertical optic furnace. In one hand it carried a staff blade longer than a man. In the other, a hooked implement that might once have been a scepter before it learned joy in vivisection. Mataras met it without waiting for orders. Their collision rang across the chamber like a struck bell. The construct's first blow drove sparks from Mataras's raised sword and knocked him back a full pace. The second came in low and nearly severed his left knee actuator. He twisted, let the hooked scepter slide past his thigh plate, then answered with a two-handed cut. That bit a handspan into the construct's side. Black fluid hissed out. The thing did not retreat. It leaned inward, close enough that its death mask reflected blue ceramite and blood across its own mirror finish, and hammered its staff blade at Matoras's throat. The duel became a storm of close metal and killing skill. Mataras fought like an ultramarine captain should have, had Titus not stood where he stood. No waste, no rage, only escalating efficiency. Yet the executioner construct was swift beyond reason, every strike calculated from alien geometries and old malice. It drove Mataras through the piles of shattered imperial relics, trampling St. Shards beneath its feet, carving columns and map reliefs into showers of stone fragments. Titus left him to it, because the data caskets mattered more. "Breach them carefully," he ordered. Cornelius approached the nearest casket and laid his palm against it. Instantly, every lumen in the chamber dimmed. He shuddered, lips peeling back from his teeth as machine glyphs began cascading up his gauntlet in lines of dead light. "I need time," he hissed. "You have moments." Beyond the chamber mouth, Gadriel's voice filled the vox with grunted reports and short kill counts. The old warrior was holding the choke point exactly as Titus had ordered, and the cost of that obedience became clear in the next minute. The destroyers had massed on him in a shrieking tide, using their own corpses as steps over the melter satchels being armed by the human engineers. Holt's tunnel men fired until their barrels glowed, and then fought with entrenching tools and knives when the enemy reached the line. A melter charge team died to the last man before setting the second pylon. Another made it, only for a Skorpek to take the sergeant's arm off at the elbow as he armed the trigger. The man held the charge activator in his remaining hand and laughed blood through broken teeth while Gadriel dragged him back by his harness. Then Gadriel nearly died. A pair of heavier destroyer forms crashed through the wreckage at once, one coming high, one low. The first drove a hyperphase cleaver into Gadriel's breastplate, hard enough to punch through the outer ceramite and bite into the fused layers beneath. Warning runes flashed across the ancient's helm. The second struck at the joints of his right leg and tore away a strip of armor and flesh together. Gadriel went down on one knee under a blizzard of blades, but the banner of the company was clipped across his back, and perhaps that mattered to him more than pain. He rose with a roar that broke the stillness of the chamber like artillery. Sword in one hand, combat knife in the other, he rammed the knife into the lower destroyer's ocular array, tore upward, then seized the embedded cleaver of the upper one and wrenched the weapon deeper through his own ruined plate, just long enough to pull its wielder into range of his sword. The return stroke took the construct's head off at the collar. Holt and two remaining engineers used that moment to rush past him and slap the next melter charges against the pylon bases, with hands slick from blood that was not all their own. In the relic chamber, Mataras ended his duel by accepting a wound no less a man would have survived. The executioner construct's staff blade punched through his left shoulder guard and out the rear in a burst of ceramite shards. Before the alien could retract, Mataras locked the haft beneath his arm, stepped inside the thing's reach, and drove his combat blade under its death mask with all the force of his transhuman strength. The blade punched through into whatever nest of intelligence lay beneath. Green fire spilled from the optic slit. The construct convulsed. Mataras ripped the blade sideways, tearing the whole face off, and kicked the body backward over the shattered remains of a saint's reliquary. Cornelius cried out. Every casket in the chamber flared at once. Streams of glyphs and impossible diagrams unfolded in the air above them. Titus saw not images, but equations of catastrophe translated into war runes, multiple worlds, convergence vectors, shard sites marked across the Vespator front, black stellar diagrams converging upon Nova Magnar like knives being drawn to a single throat. Cornelius's voice came thin and strained. It seeks reunion. Amantar gathers fragments of a greater death. Nightbringer essence, dispersed, divided, hidden, imprisoned or lost. Nova Magnar is not merely an awakening site. It is a ritual fulcrum, a convergence point. The tomb nexus is aligning the worlds around it, so the fragments can be drawn together here. The words froze even Maturus for half a heartbeat. "Can it be stopped?" Titus asked. "Yes." Cornelius swallowed blood. "This nexus can be broken, but..." The pause was enough. But what? This was meant to be found. The whole chamber shook, not from the melter charges, from far above, then again and farther off, as though other wounds were opening beneath the world. Silver's voice crashed onto the command net in clipped bursts. New risings planet-wide. Emperor, damn it! New risings everywhere. Old catacombs beneath Vortigern. Civic vault ruptures in Gathis Reach. Transit grids splitting under the eastern hive chains. This was a feint, Titus. The dead are coming up under every major city. Another voice cut over him, then another, a flood of surface panic. Requests for reinforcement, reports of collapsed understreets, whole hab wards falling into sudden green-lit chasms, priests screaming that the world had become a tomb. Titus understood the shape of defeat in the same instant as the tactical truth of local victory. The nexus was real. The charges would cripple it. The data caskets had yielded the knowledge he needed. Yet by choosing correctly, by committing to the nexus, he had obeyed the enemy's design. Amantar had pinned the blade where it could do damage without reaching the real throat. "Detonate," he ordered. Gadriel did not argue. Perhaps he heard the same ruin in the reports from above. Perhaps he was too busy holding his own organs inside his armor, with will alone. The melter charges went off in a chain of white suns. Pylons folded inward, their black surfaces running to incandescent slurry. The Cyclopean threshold shuddered. Whole files of destroyers vanished in erupting sheets of heat. The floor under the nexus split and began to sink. Titus gathered the surviving force and withdrew through collapsing galleries, while behind them, the chamber became a burning tomb of its own. They escaped into the upper ways by discipline and violence and luck in proportions impossible to separate. Mortals died by the handful buying crossroads. One ultramarine vanished into a wall when an Ophidian dragged him half-phased through living metal. Holt took a glancing Gauss wash across the torso and smelled, his own flesh cooking inside the flak. Gadriel had to be half-carried for the final ascent after his damaged leg locked at the knee, though he still snarled at every attempt to help him. Maturus left a trail of black and red from the wound in his shoulder, but said nothing of it. Cornelius clutched the stolen data core fragments to his breast as though they were poison and sacrament both. When they reached the command levels again, Nova Magnar had become a map of fresh atrocities. The casualty projections updated faster than the adepts could verify them. Tens of millions dead within hours. Tens of millions more unaccounted for, beneath collapsed civic vaults, burning transit districts and cities where the underworks had opened like jawbones. The wider campaign estimates were worse. If the outer world suffered synchronized risings at even a fraction of this scale, the loss curves became obscene, numbers so large they stopped resembling human consequence and became weather. Titus stood over the hololith, while ash drifted from cracked ceiling vents and new distress runes bloomed over the continents like ulcers. "This nexus brought us knowledge," Maturus said, voice hard with pain and fury. "Nothing more." "It brought us the truth," Gadriel answered, from where apothecaries were sealing the hole in his chest with hissing sprays of synth flesh and staples. "And the truth is filth." Cornelius had gone very pale. His eyes were fixed not on the maps, but on something behind them, as though the data casket still flickered across the inside of his skull. Titus turned to him. "Speak." The librarian's lips parted. For a moment no sound emerged. Then he whispered, and in all the chamber there was not one man who failed to hear him. "The dead thing Amantar wants is already waking." By the next false dawn, Nova Magnar no longer resembled a world at war, so much as a carcass being eaten alive from within. The hive belts burned in chains across the continents. Whole districts had sunk into underworks, suddenly made hollow by awakening tomb roads. Others still stood, but only as blackened shells filled with smoke, wounded men and the metallic dead moving between foundation columns like patient gravediggers. The sky had become an iron lid, sealed by ash, macro flak bursts, and the malignant green strobes of Gauss fire. Defense lasers still stabbed upward on blind automatics, their machine spirits too obedient to understand that the greatest enemy had no need to descend from the heavens when it already owned the earth beneath men's feet. Titus moved through that ruin as a point of decision in a war too vast for any single will to control, and still he controlled what he could. He was in Vortigern's lower barricade lines at first light, where the dead had broken through an old freight artery and turned the loading yards into a butcher's sump. He gave 3 orders, killed a score of advancing Necrons with his company, veterans, and redeployed before the smoke had finished rolling over the place. Then he was at Gathis Reach, striding through the ruins of a shell foundry as Gauss fire flensed the defenders from their emplacements in strips of red vapor and blackened bone. Then he was in the ash-blind western trenches, where a priest screamed the names of ultramarian saints through a vox horn, while men with no ammunition left fixed bayonets against things that did not fear steel. Then back again toward Bellatrix Magna, where the line was not a line any longer, but a patchwork of kill zones, rubble fortresses and transit vaults, held because Titus had marked them on a map and said they would not fall. That was enough for men. Not hope, not belief, not even courage in the clean sense. Most of the defenders had burned through courage long ago. They held because retreat no longer led anywhere survivable, because the roads behind them were cratered or infested or gone, because the underworks opened under flight as readily as under battle, and because somewhere in the choking vastness of the war there was still an Astartes captain deciding which ruins meant life and which meant death. Men took comfort from that, even when they hated him for the decisions. At the trench line before the broken mag lifts of Vortigern Secundus, Corporal Joran Bale crouched in a slit of mud and powdered ferrocrete that had once been the median of a civic avenue. It was trench by function only. Corpses made part of the revetment. Burned transport plates had been hammered into firing lips. The dead lay underfoot because there was nowhere to move them, and because they helped stop shrapnel. Bale had not slept in 2 days. He had eaten once, and he had vomited half of it back into the trench wall when the Gauss sweep took Sergeant Neral and left only boots and a smoking lasgun frame behind. The avenue before him had been broad enough once for parade engines and labor processions. Now it was a trough of wrecked armor, crater water, body parts, and drifting dust. Necron warriors advanced through it in measured files whenever the smoke thinned enough to show them, their green eyes cold as sump glass. Behind them, deeper in the ruin, heavier things moved. Bale fired until his shoulder bruised, and the power pack on his rifle clicked empty. Beside him, Trooper Leth tried to reload with hands that would not stop shaking. Somewhere to Bale's left, a bunker cupola took a direct Gauss rake and became a black skeleton full of burning men. Their screams lasted only moments. After that, there was only the stink. "Hold the avenue!" shouted Lieutenant Holt from farther down the line, his voice raw through amplification. "You hold here, or you die running. There is nothing behind you." Men laughed at that, not because it was funny, because the truth had become too simple for any other response. A shadow passed over the trench. Bale looked up in time to see the banner of the second company moving. through the smoke above the line like a fragment of cleaner sky. Gadriel walked the parapet under shelling, as though artillery were poor weather. The company standard streamed and snapped in chemwind and ashfall, blue and gold soiled by ruin, yet still impossible to mistake. Around him moved ultramarines in disciplined files, bolters firing in controlled bursts into the avenue, while mortal gunners below stared upward with the hollow awe of men seeing a myth refuse to die. Gadriel did not bellow. He did not need to. He spoke in the same tone with which another warrior might recite a roll call, and men obeyed because his certainty made disobedience seem absurd. "You have held worse than this," the ancient said, as he passed above Bale's position. Bale almost barked a protest. He had not. He had held exactly this and no worse, and exactly this was already enough to strip skin from faith. But then Gadriel stopped atop the trench lip, where the gas lines were thickest, planted, his sword point in the ferrocrete, and raised the standard against a sky the colour of old bruises. The sight of him there, banner high, while green death stitched around his silhouette, did something to the line that no sermon had managed. Men stood up again. They should not have. Several died the moment they did, ribs opening in sprays of red steam as gas beams licked across the parapet. But the line itself stiffened. Heavy teams rose from ducked panic and brought their stubbers back onto firing rails. Melter gunners crawled forward through corpse-clogged mud. Bale found his own hands steadier as he slammed home a fresh pack and leaned into the embankment to fire. A squad of Necron warriors reached the first dragon's teeth at the avenue mouth and began methodically stripping the obstacles apart with green beams. Then a new sound split the morning. Astartes' bolters were thunder. Artillery was wrath. This was something cleaner and more surgical. Orbital lance fire came down, threw the ash cover in 3 stabbing bars of white heat, and carved the avenue open from crown to crater. The lead phalanx vanished in an instant, reduced to streaks of incandescent metal and expanding gas. The ferrocrete beneath them flashed to liquid, then to glass. Bale threw himself flat and felt the heat on the back of his neck, even through flak and ash. Silver's voice arrived over the command net a heartbeat later, frayed by static and fatigue. "Fire mission complete. No second pass. I have lost another escort squadron and 2 bombardment windows in the eastern belt. Make the first strike matter." Titus was already moving before the last of the molten debris had finished hissing in the crater. He vaulted into the forward rubble with his veterans and hit the surviving Necrons from the flank, while the avenue still smoked. Bale saw him only in flashes between his own firing. A blue giant, a blade arc, a burst of detonating rounds, a warrior folded around the impact of a power-armored shoulder and broken in 2. Titus never seemed hurried. That was what unsettled Bale most. Men around him panicked, prayed, screamed, shook, bled and burned. The captain moved as if every second had already been accounted for, and nothing in this nightmare was sufficient reason to deviate from exact purpose. Later, in the shattered nave of a shrine depot, where the wounded had been stacked 3 deep, and the priests were running out of clean cloth for the dying, Titus spoke with Father Rennick of the transit clergy. The priest was a lean, grey-haired man in a blackened cassock lined with flak inserts, one arm bound in makeshift splints, his face marked by the powder burns of close battle. He smelled of incense, smoke, and opened flesh. He had been blessing ammunition crates between administering last rites, and now stood before the ultramarine captain with the stubborn fury of a man who had watched too many sons of his district die on orders given from elsewhere. "You ask them to hold sanctified rubble," Rennick said. "Boys from the understacks, dock workers, Hab militia, they cannot stand against this forever." "No," Titus replied. The priest blinked, wrong-footed by the absence of pretense. "Then why order it?" "Because forever is not the requirement. The requirement is until the next line is prepared." Rennick looked at the wounded behind him, men without legs, men without faces, men whispering prayers with blood bubbling in their throats. They are not Prometheum to be spent by the barrel. No, Titus said again, they are the Imperium's sons, and I will not insult them by claiming their deaths are anything but costly. But they are also soldiers now. Cost does not alter necessity. The priest's jaw tightened. You speak like a ledger. Titus's gaze did not move from him. Because I count what remains. Someone must. For a moment, Rennick looked ready to spit defiance into the face of a transhuman. Demigod. Then he looked back at his wounded, and some part of his anger broke against the harder shape of reality. Then give me time enough to make them die facing the right way, he said. You have it, Titus answered. In another district, beneath the torn buttresses of a pilgrim bridge, he spoke with Sergeant Halvek of the Bellatrix line companies, a square-faced veteran whose left ear had been burned away and whose flak breastplate was held together with wire and sealing paste. Halvek saluted with an arm that trembled from exhaustion. Captain, the men can hold the bridge or the cistern ramp, not both. If we split, we die in detail. Titus studied the maps flickering across his wrist display. Hold the bridge. The cistern ramp leads to 12 hab blocks, and the bridge leads to the transit artery that feeds this quarter. If the artery falls, those hab blocks die slower and no less completely. Halvek's eyes went flat with old soldiers. Comprehension. You always choose the uglier answer. I choose the answer that leaves survivors. The sergeant let out a breath that could have been laughter in another life. Then we hold the bridge. Cornelius heard voices no one else could hear. At first he had concealed it behind discipline, shrouding the strain in silence and the clipped economy of a librarian at war. But the machine voices grew bolder with every hour Nova Magnar remained contested. They threaded themselves through vox static and the howl of incoming fire. They whispered beneath the detonations of bolter shells and the prayers of dying men. They did not speak in full language always. Sometimes they were only harmonics, pulses, a grammar of cold command, and dead imperatives tapping at the base of his skull like metal fingers on a crypt lid. He stood beside Titus in the lower command vault during a brief interval of redeployment and pressed thumb and forefinger to his brow, ridge hard enough to leave dents in his own flesh. What do they say? Titus asked. Cornelius swallowed. His lips were bloodless. Not to me, through me. They are using every active signal lattice as a substrate, repeating, reinforcing, building command structures by resonance. Sometimes I think I hear words. Purge, converge, divide. Sometimes I think they are only trying to hollow me out and see whether my mind can be made to hold one of theirs. Mataurus turned sharply at that. Can it? Cornelius gave him a hard look. Not while I draw breath. Then keep drawing it. Gadriel, fresh from another circuit of the line, studied the librarian with old concern hidden under iron manners. You should be sedated between deployments. And leave you half blind in the dark beneath? Cornelius asked. No. Titus ended the exchange before it could become another argument about honor and endurance. You will tell me the instant the voices cease to be only voices. Cornelius nodded once. I will. Silver's war unfolded above them in shrinking possibilities. Each time his voice came over the command net, another piece of the fleet had been spent. A destroyer squadron burned itself out intercepting crescent craft over the moonbelts. A bulk hauler was turned into a wall of debris so troop landers could cross a killing lane. A monitor station vented half its armsmen to vacuum buying time for a lance battery to cycle. Orbital victories were recorded in the language of losses. Approach vector denied at cost of 2 escorts. Bombardment corridor preserved at cost of a carrier spine. Convoy recovered at cost of all civilian hulls in its screen. Self-amputation, Titus thought, and recognized the accuracy of the sensation. Silver was cutting away the fleet's own limbs to keep the trunk living. By the 6th hour of the cycle, the war had become openly apocalyptic. The dead no longer rose only from known breaches. Whole plazas sagged and split. Civic vaults erupted. Underhive chapel crypts vomited silver phalanxes into packed sanctuaries. A bunker chain in eastern Gathis Reach vanished under a sweep of gorse fire, so concentrated that the ferrocrete domes were left as smoking rib cages around the men inside. Armor companies tried counter-assaults down the cargo ways and were peeled open by scarab swarms and particle beams until the avenues ran with molten track links and the black skeletons of tank crews fused into their seats. Still, the defenders held. They held because the enemy had made retreat a myth. They held because the line behind them had children and medici stations and ammunition depots and wounded men too broken to move. They held because Gadriel's banner had passed their sector 2 hours earlier, and because an ultramarine captain had looked at their lieutenant and said this ground remained imperial. In another age, those would have been poor reasons. On Nova Magnar, they were enough. Bale survived the avenue, then the bridge line, then a rubble crawl through what had once been a hab market, where bodies lay in such heaps that footing was treacherous from the fat and blood worked into the dust. By then, he no longer felt like a man, so much as a pair of shaking hands wrapped around a rifle. He saw Titus again at the edge of a collapsed shrine square, speaking to a line of militia lads who could not have seen 20 years and now waited with demolition plunger cables in their fists. The captain knelt to bring his helm to their height. "You wait until the 3rd mark," he said. "Not the 1st impact, not the 2nd, the 3rd. Then you cut the supports and fall back through the west arch. Understand?" One of the boys, face white under grime, said, "What if they reach us before the 3rd, Lord?" "Then you trigger early and deny them the arch," the boy swallowed. "Yes, Lord." Titus rose. His gaze lingered on them for a heartbeat, and Bale saw then that the captain was not blind to fear. He simply refused to flatter it. The monolith came down over Bellatrix Magna just before evening should have begun, though no one on the ground could see true evening through the cloud of ash and war smoke. There was first a change in the air, a pressure like the sky drawing one long breath. Vox channels filled with broken warnings from orbit, Silver shouting target vectors, Augur adepts screaming about mass descent signatures. Then the smog above the central hive tore open in a square wound of emerald light. The thing descended slowly, majestically, obscenely, as if gravity itself had been ordered to kneel. A colossal black geometry slid through the poisoned cloud banks, trailing arcs of captive lightning and shards of green radiance. It was fortress, idol, and execution block in one shape. Its surfaces drank the light around them and returned it as malign luminescence along impossible seams. City defense batteries turned and fired on instinct. Their shots burst against unseen fields or vanished into the monolith's skin without effect. Where the construct's own flux arcs answered, hab towers ceased to be architecture and became exploding weather. It came down into the shattered heart of Bellatrix with the inevitability of divine punishment. The impact was not a single blast, but a spreading catastrophe. Whole sub-districts buckled. Transit tunnels collapsed. Men were thrown from parapets half a kilometer away. The avenue where Bale crouched vanished under a rolling wave of dust, flame, and debris. When the cloud cleared enough to see, the monolith stood amid the ruin like a tombstone for the whole hive, its portal core yawning open, spilling more warriors into streets already choked with the dead. Near extermination followed. Defense lines that had held for hours simply ceased to exist under the weight of fire, now converging on the monolith's landing zone. Titans would have struggled against such a descent. Nova Magnar had only worn tanks, exhausted men, and a handful of Astartes where they mattered most. "Titus," Silver voxed, and the Commodore's voice was hoarse with static and grief. "I cannot kill it from orbit without killing half the district around it. I have already lost another bombardment cruiser attempting vector lock." "Then do not kill it," Titus said. He stood amid a command knot under the remains of a rail viaduct, ash coating his armor, the monolith's green glare flickering across his lenses. "Blind it. Feed it the targets I choose." Matara stared at him. "You mean to pull back?" "I mean to make it believe we are breaking." Gadriel understood first. The ancient's ruined chestplate was patched with fresh sealant and scorched cloth prayers, his standard dark with grime and blood. "Into the ruins?" "Yes." Cornelius swayed where he stood, machine whispers gnawing at the edge of his composure. "The chosen killers will come, Amantar's hunters. They will scent collapse and drive for the throat." Titus looked from the monolith's towering bulk to the broken districts around it. Collapsed hab canyons, half-standing freight cathedra, transit cuts rigged for demolition, kill lanes pre-sighted by the few heavy guns still alive. A city made into bait. He opened every relevant command channel at once. "All sectors in Bellatrix Central hear me. Conduct staged retreat by marked vectors only. Abandon exposed barricades. Fall back through ruined corridors, Delta through Omicron. Leave bodies, leave wrecks, leave fire. Make it look like flight. Heavy teams withdraw last and seed the rubble with every melter, mine, and demo charge remaining. Gadriel, take the banner into the inner ruins and hold the men together. Mataurus, prepare the cut-off claws. Silver, when the hunters commit, you strike the kill box with everything you can still spare. We are not collapsing. We are opening the jaws." Around him, men listened in ash, blood, and terror. Some understood, some did not. All obeyed. Bale was one of those ordered back through the ruined corridors. He ran because the order came, and because the avenue was already becoming a grave no courage could redeem. Around him streamed auxilia, militia, priests carrying relic crates, medici dragging stretchers over broken tile, gunners wheeling the last intact heavy stubbers by hand because the tractors were dead. Above them, through smoke and falling masonry, Gadriel's banner moved once more, leading not a charge this time, but a disciplined withdrawal into the murdered heart of the hive. Behind them, the monolith glowed over Bellatrix like a second hateful dawn, and from its depths, the dead advanced into the city that pretended to yield. Bellatrix burned behind him when Titus left the surface, and he carried the knowledge of that fire into the void like a wound he had chosen to keep open. The planned withdrawal into the inner ruins had become exactly what he intended, and more terrible than he had hoped. The dead had poured after the illusion of a failing line, funneling themselves into pre-sighted kill corridors where melter mines, demolition arches, buried macro shells, and the last disciplined fires of the Bellatrix defenders had savaged them in layers. It had bought time. It had bloodied Amantar's chosen killers. It had not altered the deeper truth. More and more Necron hosts were rising under the world. More and more command impulses were pulsing through the tomb lattice. Nova Magnar could still be made to die, even if every surface engagement was won by the width of a blade edge. So Titus abandoned the comfort of local success and chose the more dangerous wound. The invasion, he judged, could not be broken from the ground alone. Not now. Not while the dead empire beneath the world answered to guidance beyond the surface breaches. Somewhere above or beyond the moon belts, some higher order of command still cohered the slaughter. Some, Lattice held the disparate tomb hosts in murderous communion. Until that lattice was severed, every defense on the surface was only the purchase of shorter delays. He made the decision in the shadow of a half-collapsed freight basilica where the command staff had relocated after the monolith's descent. Ash drifted through the broken arches. Priests moved among the wounded with censers and bolt pistols. Ammunition servitors dragged crates over paving stones, slick with blood and runoff from ruptured coolant lines. Gadriel stood beside the ruined altar with the company's standard planted in a slab of cracked marble. His battered armor lit by the green pulse of distant Gauss fire through the broken west wall. Silver's image flickered over a portable hollow emitter, the Commodore's face worn down to something bare and brutal by the last days of void war. Behind him, bridge officers ran in and out of frame like hunted men. "I have their movement patterns now," Silver said. "Not the whole of them, but enough. Tomb ships are massing on the dark side of the moon, crescent escorts, shard carriers, and one larger vessel central to the formation. It does not behave like a warship in the human sense. It is a locus. Signals rise through it and spread across every hostile contact in the inner theater." "A command vessel," Titus said. "Yes." Mataris, one arm newly sealed and repainted where the executioner construct had torn through him, leaned over the display. "Then we board it and cut out the mind." Gadriel's gaze did not leave Titus. "And the surface line?" "It remains," Titus said, "because it must." The ancient's mouth hardened. "You mean to leave it to me while you take the blade elsewhere?" "I mean to leave it in the hands of the officer, best able to keep Bellatrix alive until I return." That drew no pride from Gadriel. Only a long look weighted with old anger, old respect, and the exhaustion of one who had watched too many mortals die under colors he still refused to let fall. "You had better return," the ancient said. Titus turned to Cornelius. The librarian stood a little apart from the others, gauntleted hands clasped behind his back, with a deliberate stillness Titus recognized as discipline under siege. He had not slept. No one had. But on Cornelius, the deprivation showed worse. The skin beneath his eyes had gone grey. There were fine tremors in the fingers of his left hand. Something in the machine chorus, gnawing at his mind, had begun to leave marks. "You remain dirtside," Titus said. Cornelius's expression tightened. "I can guide you better from the vessel itself. And if the signal net takes you while you stand within its strongest source, I lose my librarian and give the enemy a weapon. You remain here and guide remotely." There was fury in Cornelius then, not at the order, but at the truth of it. "I can still master them." "I know," Titus said. "You will do so from below." Silver broke in before the tension could deepen. "The assault window will be brief. If I commit major hulls to draw the command vessel into range, I will lose them." "You will lose them anyway if the lattice remains intact," Titus answered. Silver did not deny it. In the silence that followed, the Commodore looked very much like a man being asked whether he preferred to bleed from one artery or three. "Then I will spend them where the wound matters," he said at last. The launch into orbit felt less like ascent than escape attempted under sentence. Thunderhawks rose from hidden mag yards and ad hoc landing grounds under cover of smoke, flak, and the erratic blessing of still functioning void shields. Two were lost before they cleared the lower cloud decks. One vanished in a blossom of green fire when a Gauss beam lanced through its troop bay and turned the interior into a spinning furnace. Another clipped the edge of a tumbling hab, spire segment left suspended in the sky by some monstrous accident of the monolith's arrival, and went down trailing flame into the eastern ruins. The rest climbed through the ash canopy and broke into hard black void where Nova Magnar hung below like a world under autopsy. Silver had already committed. The dark side of the moon had become a killing field. Imperial escorts, monitors, and battered line cruisers drove in attack formations so ragged they looked improvised, which they were. Lance fire strobed through vacuum. Macro battery shells bloomed in sullen chains. Against them moved the Necron fleet, with the cold elegance of mathematics, deciding that human life was no longer worth retaining. Crescent warcraft slid in impossible angles between bombardment spreads. Tomb ships drifted with stately contempt until they fired, and then ships died in clean amputations of light. Escort swarms surged from blackness behind the moon, their engines barely visible, their hulls thin and vicious as ceremonial blades. Silver's flagship came over the assault Vox. Target Locust designated Mortuary Crown. Boarding run begins now. All strike elements commit. Boarding torpedoes launched from the surviving Imperial cruisers in rippling volleys, each one a prayer of ceramite and adamant driven at a vessel that should not have existed. Thunderhawks followed in their wake, using the torpedoes' debris trails as momentary cover. Titus stood within the troop bay of the lead craft with Mataurus and the spearhead veterans, mag-locked and silent as incoming fire strobed past the hull. Through the view slit, he saw the Necron command vessel unfold from behind a screen of crescent escorts. It was vast, but size alone did not explain the wrongness of it. It seemed to alter shape according to the angle from which it was observed. Long black spars became open voids, then became ribs, then became towers. Sections of hull appeared too near and too far at once. Luminous surfaces reflected stars that were not present. Its profile was less ship than mausoleum, given motive purpose. The first boarding torpedo struck and vanished into a wall that had not seemed to be there a heartbeat earlier. The second sheared through an exposed rib of black metal and punched inward in a burst of molten fragments. Silver's voice snapped across the channel. "Go! Go now!" The Thunderhawk rammed through a screen of particle fire and latched against the wound. The impact threw even Astartes against their restraints. Warning runes flared. The ramp blew inward, and hostile geometry met them like bad doctrine-made architecture. The corridor beyond was wide enough for a tank column, and yet felt claustrophobic. It narrowed, where the eye did not look directly at it. Angles converged, retreated, and folded upon themselves. Black floor plates seemed to tilt underfoot without moving. Every instinct trained by Fortress, Void Ship, and Hive fighting found no stable measure there. Mataurus led the first push through with the savage precision Titus expected of him. Breach charge, bolter volley, advance. The corridor walls were lined with things that had once been human skin, stretched and cured into papery banners. Some still wore tattooed numbers from penal labor gangs. Some bore the cog brands of dock servitors. Between them hung dead servitors opened from throat to pelvis, their augmetics polished and their organs left in place as if for study. Beyond them, in recesses cut like shrines, perfectly preserved imperial prisoners stood upright behind clear black fields, dead or suspended or something worse. Officers in void coats, merchant captains, a navy armsman frozen with one fist still raised, a priest in respirator mask with his mouth open mid-prayer. Specimens, Titus thought. Witnesses retained for no reason a human mind could forgive. One of the veterans muttered a curse. "Eyes front," Mataurus barked. "Marvel later." They pushed deeper into the vessel, and the geometry fought them, even before the Necrons did. Corridors doubled back without intersection. Doors irised open into chambers they had just left. Stairways descended to decks above. On 3 occasions, a squad marker vanished from its assigned vector and reappeared 100 meters elsewhere, screaming over the Vox that the walls had moved around them. On the surface, Cornelius sat within a sealed command chamber under the basilica ruins, surrounded by hexagrammic wards painted in oil, blood, and machine ash. Servo skulls rotated around him, bearing relay antennas and sanctified data spines. He guided the void assault by bursts of pain. Every time he reached into the machine chorus, the vessel above bit back. Titus heard the librarians breathing over the command net, heard the effort of staying himself beneath the pressure of alien coordination. "Left," Cornelius hissed. "No, not left as you see it. Left by intention. There is a transit seam ahead that will seal. If you hesitate, move." They moved. A corridor folded shut behind them with such smooth finality that the rear guard only escaped because an ultramarine drove his shoulder through the narrowing aperture and held it long enough for the last two voidsmen to tumble through. Again, Cornelius's voice came, rawer now. There is a command chapel ahead, not a chapel, a knot. They gather there, dynastic residues, petty kings, failed lords, fragments of broken houses. Amintar has made a creed of ending. They orbit him in worship and opportunism both. The chamber they breached proved him correct. It was circular and high-vaulted, though vaulting was too human a word for a ceiling composed of interlocking black blades pointing inward like the petals of a carnivorous flower. Around the walls stood ranks of Necrons, unlike the massed warriors below Nova Magnar. These wore the remnants of dynastic splendor, tarnished crowns, cracked carapace mantles, bronze glyphs from lineages that had perhaps once ruled stars, and now had only this. Some had been modified almost beyond recognition, grafted with destroyer limbs or execution claws. Others bore the scars of ancient mutilations repaired without grace. Opportunists, believers, remnants of dead empires that had found in Amintar's cult of annihilation a purpose after decay. At the chamber's center rose a command dais, threaded with energy spines and suspended data caskets, spinning around a black core. They attacked without parley. Bolter fire shattered the front rank. A dynastic remnant crowned in split gold raised a staff and vaporized two attached voidsmen before Matoras put a combat blade through its jaw hinge and blew its spine apart with a pistol round. Another leapt from the dais with a scream of metal and carved an ultramarine from shoulder to hip before Titus caught it across the neck with his sword and severed its head in a spray of black fluid. The fight became intimate and hateful, not a phalanx action, not a measured military exchange. It was a slaughter among zealots of extinction. The Necrons in that chamber fought with conviction. They died around the black core, still trying to reach it, still trying to shield it, as if their half-dead souls had been made fervent by the promise that all organic life would end in a darkness they considered sacred. Titus reached the dais and saw what the caskets held: astral alignments, subsurface route diagrams, signal convergence paths spanning multiple worlds across the Vespertor front. At the center of them all, beneath a rune cluster marking Nova Magnar's oldest continental massif, a vault sign denoting primacy. Primary shard vault, though the data itself rendered the idea in colder language. The final convergence would happen there, not in Bellatrix, not in the transit cathedra, in the roots of the eldest landmass where something old had been buried beneath tomb, stone and forgotten eras. He tore the core free and mag-locked it to his belt. At that exact moment, Silver committed the fleet to murder by self-sacrifice. The command vessel lurched under external impact. Then again, harder. The whole geometry of the place spasmed as if outraged. Over the Vox, naval channels dissolved into a storm of shouted course corrections, impact catechisms, and death reports. Silver's voice cut through it all, thin with static and utterly calm. Battle Group Ferrum executes ramming vector. All strike forces withdraw immediately. Repeat, withdraw immediately. Titus understood what that meant before the next impact came. Major warships, not escorts, not already doomed hulks shoved forward as debris. Silver had turned the surviving heavy hulls into spears. Somewhere outside, Imperial cruisers were burning themselves onto collision courses with the mortuary crown to cripple it bodily where gunnery had failed. The command vessel shuddered as a second ram struck. Bulkheads opened and closed in rapid succession. Distant chambers, vented green fire. Necron defenders began phasing in greater numbers now, abandoning all subtle geometry to rush the intruders before the vessel died. "Move!" Titus ordered. The withdrawal was worse than the assault. Corridors that had once extended ahead now terminated in blank walls. Routes Cornelius fed them came in gasped fragments between bursts of agony. Down. Then across. No. The floor is the wall now. Emperor's mercy. Run. They ran. They fought. A veteran was taken by a portal that opened in the air and shut around his torso, leaving his legs thudding to the deck. Mataris dragged another through a narrowing seam, while Gauss Fire stripped half the paint from his backplate. Titus killed without counting, his sword and bolter working in concert through chambers of folding black angles and galleries, where preserved prisoners shattered in their specimen alcoves as the vessel broke around them. At last they reached the breach. Thunderhawks were already peeling away, under fire, while the crippled command vessel rolled in wounded majesty through the void. Out beyond it, 2 Imperial cruisers burned nose first against its spine, their own hulls splitting under the force of impact, even as they drove deeper into the enemy ship's impossible body. Silver had done it. Horribly, expensively, he had done it. The mortuary crown's signal emissions flickered, destabilized, and began to break apart in ragged cascades. The void battle was won, in the way Imperial victories often were, by dying harder and more deliberately than the foe expected. But when Titus's strike force descended back toward Nova Magnar, the world below had already crossed another threshold of damnation. They saw it before they landed. The oldest continental massif lay far to the south, a vast black range of ancient rock and industrial scars, older than the current hive age. Over it now rose a wound in reality, a darkness that did not match cloud or smoke or ordinary night. Surface. Batteries fired into that region in ceaseless arcs. Artillery walked the surrounding plains in red chains. None of it mattered. The darkness persisted, tall and gathering, and every Vox channel from the southern fronts was thick with broken prayers. Silver's battered command feed reached them as the Thunderhawk entered atmosphere. You are too late for prevention. A partial manifestation has occurred. I say again, partial. Something of the shard has emerged. No one answered immediately. The craft punched through cloud and ash into a lower sky lit by the continuous flash of bombardment. Across the front, men in trenches, bunkers, shattered habfields and tank pits were seeing the same thing. At first, many thought it smoke, given shape by artillery. Then they thought it a giant engine, half veiled by ruin haze. Then they saw it move. It walked through artillery fire. Shells burst around it and vanished into shrouds of blackness. Gauss and laser flashes alike bent or were swallowed. It did not stride so much as pass from place to place with funereal certainty. Tall beyond sanity, thin as famine, bearing the outline of a blade or scythe where its limbs should have been, the thing crossed the battlefield under a rain of munitions like death itself had decided to become visible. Men who had held against monoliths, destroyers, and the endless silver ranks now forgot discipline and stared. Across every active line, the same words spread in whispers, in screams, in choked Vox reports, and the mouths of men who had seen too much and found something worse waiting. Not a title, not a doctrine, not even a proper prayer, only terror given a shape. And in the smoke and darkness of Nova Magnar, the Reaper-shaped god fragment kept walking. By the time the shard had taken shape over the old southern massif, fear changed its nature across Nova Magnar. Men had endured the Necrons, because endurance was still possible against an enemy that could be counted, flanked, mined, shelled, delayed and killed by sufficient violence. A man could stand in a trench against silver revenants and tell himself that they were machines, that machines broke, that even if they rose again, they did so one body at a time, one breach at a time, one murderous advance after another. There was room inside that horror for discipline. There was room for duty. The thing walking beneath the smoke devoured that room. Reports came from every front in the same broken language. Gunners ceased fire and stared. Whole platoons backed away from firing steps, as though some instinct older than doctrine had seized the spine and twisted it toward flight. Tank crews who had endured Gauss storms and seen their own comrades peeled out through vision slits now screamed over the Vox in the voices of children. Priests shouted themselves hoarse, trying to force litanies through men whose mouths would not shape the words. Soldiers who could hold against robots lost themselves when confronted by something that felt like death, given fleshless outline and purpose. It moved through artillery as if shells were weather. Its shape did not remain constant except in the broadest sacrilege of it. A high, reaper-thin silhouette. A suggestion of limbs like blades. A darkness that should have been a shadow and yet cast none. Around it, the smoke ran strangely, coiling inward, thinning and thickening in rhythms not entirely natural. Men stared too long and saw different things within the same towering outline. A funeral scythe, a skeletal king, a god from before mankind had words. Whatever they saw, the result was the same. Hands shook, bladders emptied, faith turned thin. Titus watched the effect spread across the command hololith and killed the myth the moment it tried to root. "It is not death," he said. He stood in the lower command sanctum of Bellatrix, armor blackened by soot and void scorch, helm maglocked to his hip for the first time in hours. Around him, the surviving officers of Nova Magnar looked wrecked to the point of abstraction. General Castavale had not changed his greatcoat in 3 days, and dried blood had stiffened one side of it into a dark plate. Silver's image flickered over the hololith from high orbit, thinner every hour, the Commodore's face lit by bridge alarms and failing consoles. Gadriel stood with the company standard planted beside him, every inch of the old warrior a challenge thrown at despair. Mataurus had one hand braced on the edge of the tactical lectern, like a hunting beast held on a chain. Cornelius remained farther back in the chamber, head bowed, the tendons in his neck standing out like drawn cords. The hololith showed the southern fronts buckling, whole regiments in retreat, artillery arcs disordered, support columns abandoning vehicles in their haste to pull away from the advancing dark. Titus put one gauntlet against the image and expanded the threat zone outward. "It is a battlefield problem, that is. All. It can be contained, isolated, banished, or destroyed. The instant you call it anything else, it begins winning before it reaches you." General Vale gave a humorless grunt. "Tell that to the men seeing it." "I am telling it to you," Titus said. "You will tell it to them." There was iron in the words, and no comfort whatsoever. That was why they worked. Men had heard enough false reassurance to begin hating it on reflex. Titus offered none. Only shape, only task. Silver's voice crackled over the chamber. "The hostile signal emissions are intensifying in lockstep with the manifestation. Surface panic is worsening. I can hold the inner skies for a few hours more if I spend the last reserve hulls. No longer." Mataurus leaned over the map. "Then we stop feeding men into awe and strike the vault now." Gadriel turned his head slightly. "And leave the upper line to break into rout. It is already breaking." "It is bending," Gadriel said. "There is a difference." The argument might once have become another clash of tempers and doctrine. There was no strength left for that now, only function. Titus laid out the final battle plan with the coldness of a surgeon, marking where the saw must go. Gadriel would remain above and anchor the defense across the Bellatrix core, the southern feeder routes, and the inner transit arteries. He would carry the standard where the line threatened to disintegrate and keep men dying in order, rather than panic. Mataurus would descend with Titus into the oldest massif and spear the strike against the primary shard vault. The surface war would no longer aim at victory in any meaningful sense. It would buy minutes, nothing more. Millions would be fed into delaying actions, demolition holds, rearward stands, and false counterattacks, so that one Astartes thrust below the world might arrive at the critical chamber before convergence completed. Vale stared at the marked casualty zones as if they offended even a man already steeped in campaign arithmetic. These formations are already chewed to the bone. They are still in being, Titus said. They are men. Yes. The general's scarred face tightened. And you mean to spend them for minutes? Titus met his gaze. For the only minutes that matter now.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Gadriel said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, I will hold the upper world. Mataris's answer was a sharper thing. And I will cut out the lower. Cornelius lifted his head. His eyes were ringed with red, not from sleeplessness alone. Something of the machine choir had begun to stain him from within. The signal chorus is close, he said. Each word sounded dragged through pain. Very close. I hear them, even when I am not listening. I hear them beneath speech, beneath gunfire, beneath my own heart. They are trying to make my thoughts part of their lattice. Silence gathered. Can you still guide us? Titus asked. Cornelius's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not even defiance. Something rawer. Yes. For how long? The librarian looked down at his hands as if they belonged to someone already half removed from him. Long enough to open a window at the critical moment. After that, I do not know. Titus gave one nod. There was no time left for gentler lies than truth. That is sufficient. The surface war rose into operatic ruin while the strike force made ready. Macro bridges spanning Bellatrix's mid-hive canyons collapsed under sequential demolition, taking with them tens of thousands of retreating civilians, militia columns, Necron pursuers, and the last hope of orderly evacuation through the western belts. Armor formations thrown against the southern approach were not defeated so much as unmade. Gauss fire crossed over them in fan-wise curtains and peeled tanks down to burning track skeletons, while men within became bursts of red mist and calcined fragments. Infantry died by the million across the theater, though no man on the ground could comprehend the full sum. They only knew the local version of it. This trench gone silent. This avenue turned to bone ash. This command post suddenly no longer answering. The sky itself became choked with wreckage, shot down landers, orbital debris, the burning carcasses of escort craft and cargo ferries falling in long flaming arcs over the hives. At the Valeron macro bridge, Father Rennick stood with a line of transit clergy and 1,000 half-trained militia holding the demolition plunger, while Necron phalanxes advanced through smoke beneath the span. He had already given the Emperor's mercy to 30 wounded who could no longer be moved. He blessed the charges with one hand and clutched a bolt pistol in the other. Titus passed him on the way to the descent shafts. The priest looked up at the captain, and there was no anger left in him now, only a kind of exhausted clarity. "This buys you minutes," Rennick said. "Yes. Then I will make them holy." Titus looked at the men arrayed behind the priest. Hab workers, dock crews, boys from Manufactoria. Old soldiers too crippled for front-rank service, and now returned because there was nothing else between the dead and the inner arteries. Anonymous men. Countless such men. His legend, he thought suddenly, was being paid for in faces history would never keep. For the first time in the campaign, the cost of command did not reach him as numbers on a display or dispositions over a map. It struck with the particular weight of the forgotten. He understood that if he lived, if Nova Magnar lived, if this war passed into record as another triumph of ultramarine will, it would be built atop the bodies of men whose names had existed only on ration rolls, tithe lists, and casualty slates. Not all truths needed speaking. Some merely had to be carried. He inclined his head once to Rennick. "Hold until you cannot, then deny." Them, the span. The priest's face hardened into something like peace. "Go, then." Elsewhere, Gadriel moved through the meat grinder of the upper defense, as if he had been appointed soul keeper to the dying world. The banner of the second company rose over trench systems filled with smoke and vomit and the ruptured dead. It crossed shellfall and gorse storms. It climbed broken loading ramps and descended into shrine basements turned into command holes. Men saw it and believed not in survival, but in the possibility that their deaths might still be placed correctly. That was enough. Gadriel's voice rolled over the lines, measured and old and pitiless in the proper ways. Stand, reload, sight lower, kill the front ranks, and let the rest climb over their own dead. He spoke to sergeants whose eyes had gone glassy, to line officers shaking so hard they could barely hold field slates, to militia captains covered head to toe in the filth of their own collapsed sectors. He did not flatter them. He steadied them. There was a difference, and Nova Magnar was too far gone to mistake one for the other. The descent into the oldest continental massif felt like entering a wound that had been sealed for ages and was now at last opening to discharge its poison. Titus led the spearhead through basaltic bore shafts cut in eras before the current hive civilizations and through blackstone galleries that had slept beneath those eras all the same. Mataras walked at his right shoulder. Behind them came their veterans, then Holt, with a picked knot of tunnel men too scarred or too stubborn to abandon the dark, now that it had become the war's true heart. Cornelius did not descend bodily with them. He remained far above in the warded chamber, yet his presence traveled along the command net in bursts of static and pain, guiding, correcting, warning. The deeper they went, the more the vault complex shed even the pretense of being built for ordinary matter. Corridors opened into spaces whose dimensions the eye refused to keep. Stairs descended around shafts containing suspended coffins taller than dreadnought sarcophagi, each sealed behind veils of green mist. Some held skeletal forms crowned in ancient regalia. Some were empty. Others contained only scraps of blackened metal, or what might once have been pieces of something greater, divided deliberately and stored like sacrament. They entered at last into the vault chamber. It was a black cathedral of living metal, large enough to bury a city's faith beneath its scale. Arches rose like interlocked scythes above a floor engraved with concentric geometries of command and convergence. Stasis coffins lined the walls in sepulchral ranks, countless as memorial niches. Between them stood severed shard housings, broken cages, plinths built to imprison or assemble pieces of a single impossible whole. At the center rose the convergence engine, a towering mechanism of rings within rings, pylons of blackstone, gravitic needles and suspended glyph storms rotating around a dark wound in the air. The whole chamber thrummed with restrained catastrophe, and there, at the head of that machine liturgy, stood Amentar. He was taller than any ordinary Necron lord Titus had faced, narrow and elegant in the way blades were elegant, his form wrought with both regal cruelty and destroyer corruption. Dynastic finery hung from him in tatters and reworked fragments. His crown was not truly a crown, but a fan of signal spines and execution veins. Green fire burned deep in his ocular sockets, but around him there moved another shadow colder than that light, as though the shard above had cast some portion of itself downward to attend him. Even the other Necrons in the chamber seemed altered by his presence. Warriors and destroyers held the perimeter in rigid ranks, yet there was strain in the set of their frames. An old terror dragged half-conscious into machine memory. They served, they obeyed. Still, Titus saw in their minute motions the echo of something ancient recoiling before the very god fragment their master pursued. It was as though racial terror, buried since before mankind's first cities, had been forced back into awareness. Cornelius's voice came through the link in a whisper so frayed it barely resembled speech. Do not let him complete the lattice. Amentar spoke before Titus could order the charge. His voice was smooth, without effort, without rage. It filled the chamber with the calm certainty of a prophet who had no need to raise his tone because the future already agreed with him. So, the Machine Lord said, The carrion captain descends at last. Titus advanced 3 paces into the vault and raised his sword point toward the convergence engine rather than toward Amantar himself. "This ends here. Everything ends here," Amantar replied. Mataras shifted beside Titus, weight already preparing for violence. Gadriel was far, above, holding the upper world with men who were buying this moment in blood. Cornelius was somewhere in the dark of his own mind, preparing the psychic fracture that might open one instant of weakness. Silver bled the void above. Millions died in the surface meat grinder. All of it narrowed now to this chamber. Amantar spread his hands slightly, almost a welcoming gesture. "You persist in the little delusion of agency. Admirable. Organic minds require such toys. Listen well, son of a failed empire. There will be no accommodation, no treaty, no partition. Your species has nested in the crypts of greater powers and called habitation sovereignty. You built smoke hives over sepulchres, named ignorance dominion, and bred in numbers fit only for cleansing." His gaze did not waver. His voice did not sharpen. That made it worse. "I offer you no negotiation. I offer your kind conclusion. The worlds of this front, then the realms beyond them, will be stripped to silence. Flesh will be burned from history. Your saints, your primarchs, your little thrones of worship, all will pass into the same dark inventory." The green geometries of the convergence engine brightened behind him. Amantar inclined his head a fraction, as if granting Titus the courtesy due a condemned but stubborn beast. "Be still," he said, "and witness extermination." The first blow fell without ceremony. Amantar moved from stillness into murder, with such perfect economy that even Titus, who had expected speed, understood a fraction too late that the Machine Lord had already chosen his first kill before he finished speaking. The Necrosaur crossed the black floor in a blur of regal silver and shadow, one elongated arm unfolding into a crescent blade of viridian-edged death. The strike did not come for Titus, it came for Holt. The line officer had only just brought his lascarbine up when the blade passed through him at the waist. For one obscene instant, the man remained upright, surprise widening his soot-caked face. Then his torso slid from his hips in a wet red spill and struck the engraved floor with a sound like butchered meat dropped on stone. "Engage!" Titus voxed, though the order was already obsolete. The vault erupted. Bolter fire crashed through the black cathedral in thunderous sheets. Veteran ultramarines opened into the perimeter ranks, detonating Necron warriors at the knees and chest, tearing silver bodies into showers of necrodermis and black fluids. Destroyers sprang from the flanks with rabid purpose, their movements sharpened by proximity to the convergence engine. Mataras drove left with the veterans assigned to him, smashing into a knot of Scorpex before they could sweep the rear of the formation. Titus met Amantar in the center. The first exchange hammered sparks the color of old suns across the chamber. Titus's power sword caught the descending crescent blade half a handspan from his helm. The impact bit through his stance and drove him back a full pace, boots scoring grooves in the living metal floor. Amantar did not press wildly. There was nothing frenzied in him. He fought with the calm of an executioner who had spent ages refining the most efficient means of ending flesh. His second strike cut low for Titus's knee seals. The third flowed upward toward the throat. The fourth was not a strike at all, but a feint designed to open Titus's ribs to a hidden secondary blade extruded from the Machine Lord's opposite forearm. Titus saw the pattern a heartbeat before it closed and turned with it, letting the killing edge scrape sparks from his cuirass rather than enter his chest. He answered with a point-blank bolt shell into Amantar's torso. The shell detonated, blowing away plates of ancient metal and exposing a writhing lattice of green-lit mechanisms beneath. Amantar stepped through the blast, as though the injury had merely altered arithmetic. "Correct," the Machine Lord said, voice level even in combat, "but incomplete." His return blow struck Titus in the side, hard enough to crack ceramite. Warning runes flashed scarlet across the captain's helm display. Pain went hot and immediate through his ribs. He ignored it and countered with 3 disciplined cuts designed not to overpower, but to probe, measure, force the enemy to declare how it recovered from damage. Amintar parried each with maddening precision, body flowing around injury points Titus had already opened, living metal knitting even as it moved. Titus learned 2 truths at once. Amintar could be hurt. Amintar could not be beaten by ordinary accumulation of hurt quickly enough to matter. All around them, the wider battle convulsed. Matarus led the leftward wedge deep into the chamber depths, where secondary pylons fed the convergence engine through archways lined with stasis coffins and shard housings. Destroyers met him there in numbers too great for honor and too fast for comfort. A Skorpek lord, with one shoulder still draped in the cracked mantle of some dead dynasty, hit the Ultramarines' line head-on and carved one veteran from collar to groin before Matarus took its weapon arm off at the elbow and head-butted the silver skull into fragments. The veterans around him fought in tight, brutal economy, step and fire, cut and thrust, each kill opening room for the next. Push to the pylons, Matarus growled. No stoppage, no backward steps. One of the tunnel men died with the detonation plunger still clutched in both hands. Another tripped over a severed limb and vanished under a wave of scarabs that reduced him to red slick and stripped bones in seconds. Matarus did not pause for either death. He cut his way toward the pylon clusters, because that was what the battle required, and because there was no surviving version of this war in which mercy to the fallen altered the living mathematics. Far above, Gadriel held the upper world together by carrying the soul of the company through hell. The Bellatrix core had become a landscape of collapsing macro bridges, torn transit viaducts and artillery craters wide enough to drown armored columns. The shard shadow lay across the southern horizons like a bruise on creation itself. Under that blasphemous silhouette, the Necron advance thickened, and human formations that had already spent every ordinary reserve of nerve now fought with the numb desperation of men too exhausted to do anything except obey the next shouted instruction. Gadriel walked through them with the banner raised. Shell bursts through fountains of ferrocrete and body parts around him. Gauss fire licked close enough to burn green reflections across the gold trim of the standard. Still the ancient advanced from line to line, his sword slick with oil and blood, his voice rolling over the trenches and rubble emplacements. Not another step back. You die here or you kill here, but you do not yield this ground to the dead. At the Valeron macro bridge, Father Rennick stood with his demolition cohorts, while Necron phalanxes crossed the lower causeways below in disciplined silver tides. The bridge had been rigged to collapse the moment the defenders broke. Gadriel planted the standard at the bridgehead and personally led the counter-assault that bought the priest his final minutes. Men rallied because he was there. They surged out of trench pits and broken hab entrances with bayonets, axes, work saws, and the insane courage of those who had already made peace with not seeing another dawn. When the dead finally reached the bridge supports in strength, Gadriel remained at the far side long enough to drag 40 wounded men back across the span, while Gauss fire cut his honor guard down around him. Father Rennick met his eyes across the demolition switch. No words were needed. Gadriel carried the standard clear. The priest triggered the charges, and the macro bridge came down in a roaring canyon of fire and collapsing steel, taking Rennick, the advancing Necrons and half the river district into the abyss together. The surface line saw the standard emerge through dust and ruin a minute later and understood the bridge had been spent. They held anyway. In orbit, Silver fought the collapse of a fleet that no longer possessed enough mass to deserve the name. Reserve ships were all that remained, battered escorts, one maimed light cruiser, 2 ammunition scows fitted with emergency guns, and whatever merchant hulls had survived long enough to be armed by desperation. The Commodore stood upon his bridge beneath sparking lumen strips and a cracked command screen, while the void around Nova Magnar burned with falling debris, crippled crescent craft, and the flash of weapons too violent for human eyes to treat as anything but storms. The mortuary crown was dying, but not dead. Its signal emissions strobed in wounded bursts, still feeding the convergence below. Other tomb ships moved to shelter it, and the last Imperial hulls moved to die, obstructing that attempt. "Helm," Silver said, voice stripped to command and fatigue. "Commit the reserve pattern." The bridge officers looked at him as men look at a sentence already passed. "That will endanger the strike force, Lord Commodore." "Yes, and the lower atmosphere bombardment spread may bracket our own ground holdings." "Yes." Silver watched the tactical spread without blinking. "There are no safe options. Execute." The surviving reserve ships turned toward the engagement line like sacrificial animals choosing the knife. Their bombardment pattern would drive fire not merely into the shielding tomb ships above, but through predetermined windows into the atmosphere over the oldest massif. If Titus still lived below when the pattern landed, he would live by meters or die by them. Silver accepted that, because the war had reached a point where any other kind of acceptance was childish. Below, in the vault, Cornelius burned. The librarian sat inside the warded chamber beneath Bellatrix, with blood running steadily from his nose, ears, and left eye. Servo skulls spun around him, trailing incense and static. The machine choir was no longer whispering. It had become a screaming horizon of command, a dead empire trying to use the shape of his thoughts as additional circuitry. He fought it by force of soul and the ruin of parts of himself. Every contact with the convergence engine cost memory. He felt them go. Old lessons from Macragge, faces of fallen brothers, entire catechisms cracking and washing away in white pain the moment he pushed harder into the lattice. Still, he pushed. "Titus," he gasped into the command link, voice barely human beneath the strain. "I can fracture it, not stop it. Fracture only. When it opens, you will have one moment where the rhythms do not align. One." In the vault, Titus fought and listened and adapted. He had already learned. That simple destruction of Amentar's body would not suffice. The Machine Lord was not merely commander. He was nexus. Even as Titus carved him open, even as shells burst within his torso and sword cuts split his limbs to black fluid and sparking internals, the surrounding destroyers responded to each movement of their master, as if the battle itself were one circulatory system, and Amentar its diseased heart. Kill the body, and the lattice might still complete. Break the body, and the shard might still converge. The bond had to be severed at the level of command and engine both. He gave ground deliberately, shaping the duel toward the central convergence apparatus. Amentar read the tactic and almost admired it. "You finally understand," the Necrosaur said, as he glided through another exchange, blade cutting Titus from shoulder to lower rib in a spray of sparks and boiling blood. "This is not a duel. It is communion. I do not stand at the center. I am admitted there." Titus answered with a bolter shell through the Machine Lord's jaw. Half the face vanished. The other half continued speaking as living metal flowed and resealed. "Then I will deny your admission." Amentar's next strike severed Titus's left forearm at the vambrus. The hand spun away, still gripping the pistol, trailing blood and black cabling from the armor linkages. White agony burst through Titus's vision, bright enough to erase the chamber for a heartbeat. He stepped into the pain instead of away from it, used the motion to drive his sword two-handed through Amentar's ruined face and out the back of the skull. The Machine Lord convulsed. Titus ripped the blade free, kicked him backward toward one of the convergence rings, and voxed without a tremor in his voice. "Apothecary bind, I remain combat effective." He was. Barely. Blood sheeted down his armor. Internal injectors slammed coagulants and pain suppressants into his system. His left arm was gone below the elbow, the stump spurting until auto-tourniquets bit down. He ignored all of it. An ultramarine did not win by remaining unwounded. He won by denying the enemy any useful consequence from the wound inflicted. Mataurus reached the pylon cluster at the chamber depths and understood immediately what had to be done. The secondary pylons were shielded by a lattice cage of blackstone and living metal so dense that planted charges would not breach them cleanly in time. Beyond them surged more destroyers, drawn by Amantar's will and the shards gathering pressure. If the pylons remained intact, the convergence engine would retain enough coherence to endure even a psychic desynchronization for the heartbeat needed to complete its work. Mataurus laughed once, not because anything was amusing, because the answer was now obvious. He tore the detonation harness from the last surviving engineer, slung the melter charges across his own scarred frame, and looked at the two veterans remaining beside him. "Back!" he ordered. One of them shook his head. "Brother, back." They obeyed because he was Mataurus, and because obedience was the final form of respect left in war. Destroyers hit him as he charged. One carved his thigh open to the bone. Another drove a blade through the side of his neck guard and snapped it off there. Mataurus kept going. He smashed into the lattice cage like an artillery round in blue ceramite, jammed the melter satchels into the pylon junctions with his remaining strength, and locked both arms around the structure, as if embracing an enemy he meant to drag into damnation. The last thing Titus heard from him over the squad channel was not a prayer. Now. The detonation ripped the chamber depths apart in white heat and collapsing blackstone. The secondary pylons vanished. The blast wave hurled destroyers in burning pieces through the air and folded half the rear gallery inward. Mataurus went with it, consumed inside the bloom he had made. The convergence engine screamed, not audibly, mechanically. A vast mismatch of failing alignments and wounded gravitic harmonics shuddered through the vault. For the first time, the rotating rings at its center lost perfect sequence. Cornelius felt it from worlds away and opened the fracture with what remained of himself. Every ward in his chamber blew out. Servo skulls burst in rings of fire. The librarian's spine arched as psychic force tore through his mind and used it as a blade. Memories incinerated, portions of language, fragments of identity, whole shelves of the self burned away to carve a single wound into the machine choir. Through that wound, the convergence engine fell half a beat out of time with itself. "Titus," he whispered, and there was nothing left of his voice except need. "Now." Amantar knew at once what had happened. For the first time, something like urgency entered his movements. Not panic, never that, but urgency, cold and precise. He broke from the duel's previous economy and lunged for the heart of the engine, trying to restore the bond, to re-enter the command alignment before the desynchronization widened. Titus gave him no such path. He threw himself bodily between Amantar and the wounded center. The two of them hit the central rings together, and the battle became grotesquely intimate. No longer the exchange of elegant killing forms, but a grappling slaughter between two beings too damaged to afford anything except direct termination. Amantar's blade entered Titus below the ribs and exited through the backplate in a wash of blood and burst seals. Titus answered by driving his sword through the machine lord's shoulder joint and sawing downward until the entire arm came free. Amantar's remaining hand punched clawed fingers into Titus's chest wound, ripping at flesh beneath cracked ceramite. Titus headbutted the Necron lord hard enough to burst both his own brow seals and the machine's regrown face. Blood and black fluid sprayed together across the engine housings. Around them, living metal kept knitting. Armor kept failing. Blood boiled where it touched overheated surfaces. Amantar's severed limb crawled toward his torso like a silver insect seeking reunion. Titus stamped it flat, then stamped again until the pieces stopped moving. The Machine Lord drove a knee blade into Titus's thigh, tearing the muscle almost free of the bone. Titus roared once, not in pain, but in effort, and wrenched Amantar bodily into the innermost ring of the Unmaker architecture. Only then did he see the solution fully. The convergence engine had been designed not merely to gather the shard, but to discipline its presence through nested annihilation fields, to contain by controlled unmaking whatever could not safely be touched. With the secondary pylons destroyed and Cornelius's fracture still widening, the engine could be inverted, not shut down, not destroyed cleanly, turned against itself, turned inward, so that the command nexus, the bond to the destroyer hosts, and the shard harmonics all began devouring one another in the same instant. He could not simply kill Amantar. He had to make Amantar the anchor point of collapse. Titus locked his sword through the Necrosaur's torso and into the control spindle behind him, pinning Machine Lord and engine together. Amantar understood the trap even before the captain did. His eyes flared bright enough to cast harsh shadows across the bloodied floor. "You are too late," he said, voice still calm, though the ring mechanisms around him began to spin in injured sequence. "If I fall, the hunger remains." "Perhaps," Titus said. With his one remaining hand, he ripped free the command core he had taken from the mortuary crown and slammed it into the exposed spindle housing. Imperial wreckage, Necron command logic, wounded convergence rhythms. The systems rejected one another instantly. Glyph storms turned. Jagged, the rings accelerated, halted, reversed, collided. Blackstone pylons began shedding flakes of matter into nothingness. Amantar tried to tear free. Titus held him there through sheer failing strength and hatred disciplined into purpose. "Then you fall first." Over the Vox, Silver's final bombardment pattern entered atmosphere. In Bellatrix and Valeron and the trench worlds of the southern belts, men looked up through ash and smoke to see the sky suddenly lined with falling fire, reserve ships dying in orbit, debris trails, lance strikes. The whole wounded heaven seemed to descend upon Nova Magnar in judgment. Gadriel, still carrying the banner through the surface line, saw it and knew the last reserve had been spent. He also knew what that meant. There would be no extraction window worthy of the name after this. No clean recovery. Only whatever survivors could crawl out of the blast shadow if the world itself allowed it. He turned to the men around him, to the ragged companies and artillery remnants and militia knots who had followed the standard through ruin after ruin and planted the banner on the lip of a shattered trench while the ground began to shake beneath their boots. "Stand," he told them. "Whatever happens below, we stand." So they stood. In the warded chamber, Cornelius collapsed over the relay throne, blind in one eye and bleeding from every orifice. The machine voices were gone. So, he thought dimly, were many other things. He could not remember the second half of Mataurus's name. He could not remember the litany for void crossing. He could barely remember his own breathing, unless he forced attention upon it. But the fracture held. In the vault, Titus saw the annihilation event begin in the widening of one impossible line. A seam of utter black opened through the heart of the engine. Not shadow, absence. Rings folded toward it, pylons bent inward. Amantar's lower body vanished at the edge of the seam and did not return, not even as fragments. The Machine Lord looked down at his own unmaking with something that might have been ancient recognition. Then the calm finally broke, not into screaming. Never that. Amantar's voice remained level to the end, but beneath it there came the first tremor of something older than command, older than empire. The cold memory of a race that had once feared the god whose pieces it now sought to gather. "You condemn more than one world," he said. Titus's vision had begun to grey at the edges. His blood ran freely down the engine housing. He did not know whether he could still release his grip if he wished to. Good. He kicked off the collapsing spindle at the last possible instant, and threw himself clear as the Unmaker architecture folded inward around Amentar, the convergence core and the wounded shard harmonics all at once. The detonation did not come as fire. It came as a shudder in reality. Across Nova Magnar, the surface armies felt. The planet convulsed beneath them. Trenches collapsed. Rubble shifted. Macro bridges already broken leapt in their own ruin. Men on the firing lines staggered and looked around as the very crust seemed to recoil. The shard silhouette above the southern massif faltered. For one impossible instant, every living soul within sight of it had the dreadful impression that something ancient had just screamed from inside the bones of the world. The scream that passed through Nova Magnar's bones did not end the war in a single blessed instant. It broke it. Across the hive belts, in the trench mazes, under the collapsing transit cathedra, and along the ash plains where millions had died without witnesses, the Necron host faltered, as though some central law of its hatred had just been cut out and thrown into the dark. Phalanxes that had advanced with pitiless synchrony lost their perfect intervals. Warriors halted mid-step, heads turning in sharp, uncertain movements as green fire guttered behind their eye lenses. Destroyers that had fought with murder-mad purpose convulsed, staggered, or turned their blades upon whatever stood nearest, friend and foe alike, as the bond that had disciplined their ruinous appetites collapsed into static and broken command. Monolithic engines that had descended like verdicts from a dead heaven flickered along their glyph seams and began phasing out in ragged bursts, their geometries destabilizing, their portals vomiting partial ranks of half-coherent constructs before the machines themselves vanished into sick green storms of retreat. On the southern fronts, men who had already accepted extinction looked up from their firing steps and watched the Reaper shadow above the old massif unravel. It did not explode. It dispersed. Vast limbs of darkness seemed to lose conviction, bleeding apart into veils of smoke and impossible absence. The silhouette of the shard thinned, twisted and stretched across the poisoned sky until it no longer resembled a walking god, so much as the after-image of one dragged backward through a wound in the world. Artillery continued firing because no one trusted the sight enough to stop. Shells burst through the dissolving shadow. Lances from the last orbital guns stabbed down into the thinning dark. At last, the shape broke apart altogether, not destroyed cleanly, but scattered, as if some enormity had been struck and forced to become fragments once more. Then the withdrawal began in earnest. Necron constructs phased from battle lines in waves, not all at once, and not in mercy. Many continued killing until the last second, carving men down from parapets or stripping trenches to skeletal mud before their bodies broke into streams of green motes and were gone. Others simply stopped moving and toppled where they stood, dead for true or as near to true as such things allowed. A few remained active but directionless, wandering through the ruins like broken thoughts until concentrated fire tore them apart. Across Nova Magnar, the dead empire recoiled from the world it had almost claimed. The humans did not cheer. There were no triumphal cries rising from Bellatrix Magna or Vortigern or the blasted refinery coasts. There were only men standing in trenches with empty rifles and blood dried to black crust on their hands, staring at avenues suddenly absent of advancing silver. There were tank crews climbing from hulls that no longer had engines and finding no enemy in front of them, only piles of burned metal and their own dead. There were priests lowering bolt pistols from wounded men's foreheads, because for a little while at least, the immediate need for mercy killings had passed. There were artillery officers receiving no fresh target coordinates and continuing to shout for range corrections out of exhausted habit until someone touched their shoulder and told them the line had gone quiet. They did not celebrate because the scale of what had been spent was beyond celebration. Cities were still burning. Oceans along the industrial coast had turned iridescent with reactor runoff, oil fires, gas residue and corpse ash. Entire sections of the southern sea steamed with chemical poisons vented from breached processing plants, turning the surf into bands of green and black foam that killed carrion birds mid-flight. Bellatrix Magna was gutted from underhive to upper rail in whole districts. Valeron existed now as a chain of smoking chasms bridged by rubble. The grain plateaus of the outer continents had become grave fields crossed by abandoned transports and the bones of those who had tried to flee too late. The casualty ledgers climbed even after the shooting slowed, because so many millions were not dead in the simple sense, but buried, poisoned, irradiated, burned beyond easy counting, or missing beneath transit collapses and tomb ruptures. Adepts worked in relay shifts to collate the numbers and failed to keep pace with reality. At a certain point, the tallies lost meaning to the mortal mind. Tens of millions dead, tens of millions more crippled, displaced, or unaccounted for. Urban populations reduced to smoke and abstractions. Regiments erased so completely that only a quartermaster's storage slate proved they had ever existed. It was victory only because extinction had been worse and nearer. Titus crawled from the vault half dead. The rescue teams found him in a chamber of twisted blackstone and fused metal where the convergence engine had collapsed into a crater of impossible residue. The very walls around the breach had taken on a glassy sheen, as though the air itself had briefly burned. He was lying amid shattered ring segments and dead glyph housings, with his sword still clenched in his remaining hand. His left arm ended below the elbow in a cauterized ruin of plate and meat. One thigh plate had been opened and crushed so badly that the apothecaries feared the leg lost before they cut away the outer ceramite. The wound through his torso had sealed only because every injector in his armor had exhausted itself, forcing life to remain in him by stubborn chemistry. He did not ask whether they had won. He asked first for the situation map. They brought it to him while Medici servitors stapled flesh and bonded synth skin across the holes Amantar had left in him. Titus studied the planetary spread from a field cot in a shattered command redoubt dug into the lower slopes of the old massif, his face grey with blood loss and his jaw set like iron forced thin. He took in the disordered Necron withdrawals, the zones still contaminated, the collapsing refugee flows, the destroyed transit spines, the surviving manufactoria, the damaged orbital corridors. Only after he had measured what remained usable did he allow the apothecaries to sedate him for the bone grafting. That was how Nova Magnar learned the nature of its salvation. Not as a moment of exaltation, not as a conquering hero born from battle. As a captain in ruined armor, one arm gone, mapping salvage and supply, while millions of his saviors and subjects still died in the rubble. Gadriel found him after the first surgical rites were complete. The ancient looked older than he had at any prior point in the war, which for one such as him meant not weakness, but weathering severe enough to become visible. His chest armor was a patchwork of hasty repairs over rent ceramite and half-healed wounds. The company standard, cleaned as well as any serf could manage in a world of dust and blood, rested in a casing by his side. He stood for a time over Titus without speaking. "The line still holds," Gadriel said at last. Titus opened one eye. "Then you held it. We held enough of it." That was as close to pride as the old warrior would come. Titus looked past him. "Casualties." Gadriel gave them. Company losses, human losses, the dead at the bridge, the dead in the cathedral lines, the dead in the false, retreat, and the killbox. Every name of an ultramarine fallen. Titus listened in silence. When Gadriel spoke Matoris's name, the chamber remained still for a moment that felt larger than the rest. "Nothing recoverable," the ancient said. Titus closed his eye again. There was no eulogy then, no hollow invocation, only the hard acceptance that one more brother had gone into memory, and that the company which emerged from Nova Magnar was smaller not only in number, but in weight. Matoris's absence had shape. Men in the surviving squad still turned at moments, as though expecting his voice in their vox bead. Gadriel, who had argued with him like an older brother with a younger one, too much alike to like each other easily, bore that absence in the set of his shoulders. "He broke the rear pylons," Gadriel said quietly. "I know," Titus answered. Silver survived the Void War because ships under him kept choosing to die first. His flagship limped in high orbit with half its dorsal batteries gone, 3 decks vented, and whole compartments sealed forever around fires. The damage control crews no longer had the strength to master. Of the reserve pattern he had committed, almost nothing remained. One escort drifted powerless over the moon belts. Another had to be scuttled after its reactor spine cracked. The 2 ammunition scows were simply gone, converted in their final moments into bursts of ordnance large enough to tear open the shielding around the tomb ships they struck. Silver's face on the post-battle hollow looked cadaverous. He had won the inner void by amputating every limb he possessed and discovering there was still one more cut to make. "We hold the orbital lanes for now," he said in the first full war council after the battle. "Do not ask me to promise longer than now." No one did. The men around the table had learned enough of truth to leave impossible promises unrequested. Cornelius survived too, though survival had become a question of definition. He was carried into the council chamber by servo-assisted orderlies when he insisted on attendance despite the Medicai's objections. One side of his face had gone slack from strain. His left eye no longer tracked properly. The psychic hood he wore was cold and disconnected, its coils burned out and blackened. He moved as a man moves through a half-remembered room in his own childhood home, recognizing some objects, pausing at others, uncertain why they mattered. When Titus addressed him as librarian, Cornelius turned, and for a second did not seem to recognize the title as belonging to him. Then memory, or enough of it, returned. "The signal choir is broken on Nova Magnar," he said. He paused, searching for the shape of the next sentence, as though language itself had to be hauled up from a pit. "But not ended, not in the wider theatre. I can feel emptiness where parts of it should be, and still the rest hums beyond range." "Can you fight?" Gadriel asked, not unkindly. Cornelius's ruined eye drifted toward the table. "Yes," he said after a long moment, "though I may no longer remember all the reasons why." No one in the chamber mistook the line for wit. The human survivors gathered where they could, which was often nowhere worthy of gathering. Shrine courtyards without roofs, transit tunnels no longer connected to any live district, cargo yards carpeted in ash. They queued for water and corpse starch and Mediki triage, under the gaze of soldiers too exhausted to bully them harshly. Some asked who had won and received shrugs in reply. Some did not ask at all. They had seen the dead vanish, and that was enough to understand that something had changed. Yet they also saw the ruins around them, the endless black columns of smoke, the wounded stacked in cathedral naves and loading bays, the salvage gangs already stripping the dead for usable kit before the bodies had cooled. A man would have needed madness or rank, privilege to call it triumph. On the 3rd day after the convulsion, Titus walked Bellatrix Magna. He refused a litter. He refused to remain in the Medici stronghold. One new bionic temporary frame had been locked over the stump of his left arm. Not a true replacement yet, only a war brace with a servo clamp where a hand would later be. His gait remained stiff from the damage to his thigh and side, but he moved through the city on his own legs, accompanied by Gadriel, a pair of veterans and whatever local officers were unlucky enough to be nearest whenever he wished to inspect something. He walked the transit cathedral where the first true line had held and found the floor still marked by fused patches of necrodermis and the black sprays where scarabs had stripped tanks to their skeletons. He walked the avenue of the false retreat and counted which ruined corridors could still be cleared for convoy passage. He climbed the broken edge of the Valeron macro bridge and looked down into the smoke chasm where Father Rennick and thousands of others had disappeared in fire and falling steel. He passed refugee pits where men stared at him with the dazed disbelief reserved for figures who had become legend during the battle and nuisance during the reconstruction. He was not offended by the stare. He had no use for adoration. He wanted road capacity, ammunition throughput, viable hab density, disease risk, contaminated water indexes, and estimates of how many shell lines could resume operation before the month's end. A world had been saved only in the sense that it still existed. Now it had to be made useful before the next war reached it. That was the cruelty beneath every reprieve in the Imperium. Survival was not rest. It was simply the right to resume obligation. The reports from the wider Vespertor front arrived in damaged waves. Some worlds had held their tomb emergencies by luck, terrain, or the timely arrival of fleet support. Others had not. Relief routes remained compromised. Convoys were still dying in the void. Several minor systems on the edge of Ultramar's influence had gone silent altogether, not confirmed lost, but absent from all current astropathic exchange. Rumors spread faster than verified intelligence. Entire moon chains swallowed by awakening crypts. A shrine world darkened under a storm no augur could read. Merchant crews whispering that they had seen the Reaper's shadow in the void itself between systems, thin and dispersed, but not gone. No report could yet prove that the Nightbringer essence had been wholly destroyed on Nova Magnar. The best assessments, including Cornelius's uncertain psychic reading and the data taken from the mortuary crown, suggested something worse and more plausible. The manifestation had been broken, its convergence ruined, its gathered strength dispersed. But dispersed was not annihilated. Fragments could have fled along damaged signal paths, bled back into shard prisons elsewhere, or simply scattered beyond immediate sensing. The dread that haunted the campaign was not that they had seen a god and survived it. It was that they had perhaps only interrupted its attempt to become more whole. The final war council took place in a command chamber, rebuilt from a ruined governor's hall, whose upper windows still looked out on a city of smoke and crippled light. Titus stood, rather than sat. Around him gathered what remained of the command heart that had not yet been killed or reassigned. Gadriel with the standard behind him like an accusation against despair. Silver present only as hollow-static, a ghost in naval grey. Cornelius pale and half-burned from within. General Vale in the same soot-stiff greatcoat, thinner now and somehow older, the anger that had once sharpened him worn into a heavier kind of endurance. No one pretended that Nova Magnar had come through intact. Silver gave the void truth first. We can hold the immediate lanes if reinforcements arrive before our engines die harder than their machine spirits can forgive. If not, we become a local fleet in a theatre that still thinks itself a front. Vale followed with the ground truth. Core manufactoria can return to diminished output. Outer continents remain functionally lost for now. Food will be a problem before ammunition unless the plateau convoys resume under escort. Refugee control is failing in 3 major belts. Disease will kill almost as efficiently as the Xenos if we do not get the corpse pits under control. Gadriel gave the martial truth. The company is blooded to a shadow of itself, but fit to fight if fit is measured in will. Men still look to the banner and stand. Cornelius spoke last and slowest. The enemy's coherence is broken here. Elsewhere I cannot promise it. There are awakenings yet unfinished. There are commands still moving in the dark. And there are absences in my mind where answers may once have been. The chamber fell quiet after that. Not hopelessly quiet. Merely quiet in the way a battlefield sometimes became after the guns moved on and the dead remained to explain what words could not. Titus looked from one face to the next. "Nova Magnar stands," he said. "That is not enough, but it is not nothing. We hold what remains. We rebuild what can be rebuilt. We use this world again because the Imperium has no luxury of sentiment, and because every surviving forge, rail, and regiment will be needed before this front is done." Vale's mouth twitched with old bitterness. Civilization preserved one corpse pile at a time. "Yes," Titus said. There was no cruelty in the answer, only recognition. Silver's hollow flickered. "And when the next world calls?" Titus turned his gaze toward the smoke beyond the shattered windows, toward the dead city trying already to return to function because it knew no other religion. "We answer." No flourish followed, no vow crafted for remembrance. The men in that chamber had heard enough of grand speeches to last several lifetimes and had outlived most of the speakers. Duty, in the end, was simpler and much heavier than rhetoric. Hold one world, then another, then another. Endure the mathematics, even when it sickened the soul. Keep civilization alive, not as an abstract glory, but as a chain of hab zones, transit arteries, shell lines, grain stores, orbital docks, and men willing to die in the right order. That was Ultramarian reclamation, not splendor. Maintenance under siege. When the council broke, Titus climbed the upper shell of the governor's hall alone. False dawn had come to Bellatrix Magna, though the word dawn suggested more grace than the world possessed. The light was weak and sickly, filtered through ash and industrial haze and the residue of too many fires. It touched the ruins in dirty gold. Broken towers, shattered bridges, smoke columns, districts without power, the distant glitter of salvage crawlers moving like insects through the carcass of the city. Somewhere bells were ringing for the dead, or for the work shift, or for both. On Nova Magnar, the distinctions were narrow. Titus stood above the dead city, with one hand of flesh and one temporary iron claw, his armor scarred beyond beauty, his body cut open and repaired and still unhealed. Behind him lay the cost of one world not dying completely. Ahead of him lay the greater war, still burning across the Vespator front, still threatening other worlds in Ultramar, still alive with tomb awakenings, starving fleets, and rumors of dispersed god shards moving through the dark. He looked over the ruins for a long time. He had not ended the nightmare. He had only forced it to retreat,